The chill of the pre-dawn stone seeped through the thin leather of her sandals, a familiar and unwelcome greeting. Elara shifted the weight of the bronze ewer, its lip beaded with condensation, and watched her breath plume in the thin mountain air. Below, the valley of Phocis was still a great bowl of shadow, but the peaks of the Parnassus range to the east were already limned in the palest silver. Another day was coming to Delphi, the navel of the world, and with it, the endless procession of kings and farmers, all desperate for a sliver of the future. For Elara, the future was as predictable as the sunrise. It smelled of water from the Castalian spring, of burnt barley and the cloying sweetness of laurel leaves smoldering on the altar fires. It was the rhythmic drone of the priest's morning paean to Apollo, the scrape of her broom on the sacred precinct's flagstones, and the ache in her young back. At 16, she was one of the junior acolytes, a girl of no notable lineage, left at the temple steps as an infant. Her world was this mountain, this sanctuary, and the towering, inscrutable figures who moved through it. Her task this morning was different. Lyra, one of the senior priestesses, had fallen ill with a fever, and the duty of cleansing the Adaton, the inner sanctum where the Pythia gave her prophecies, had fallen to Elara. It was an honor reserved for the most trusted, a terrifying, exhilarating honor. The Adaton was a place forbidden to all but the highest ranks, a chamber where the god himself was said to speak. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she followed the High Priest Lycomedes, his white robes whispering over the polished floor. His face, framed by a severe gray beard, was a mask of stern piety. He unlocked the heavy cedar door with a bronze key that looked as ancient as the mountain itself. The air that washed out was cool and strange, thick with the scent of something more than just incense. It smelled of ozone, of deep earth, and of something else, something metallic and wild, that made the hairs on her arms stand up. "You will touch nothing but the floor and the offering bowl." Lycomedes' voice was a low rumble, devoid of warmth. "Use the sacred water. Cleanse the stains of the last petitioner's sacrifice. Do not look upon the Pythia's tripod for longer than a glance. The god's presence lingers. A mind like yours is not strong enough to bear it." Elara nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the intricate mosaic at her feet depicting Apollo slaying the python. Lycomedes watched her for a long moment, his gaze sharp and probing, before he turned and left, the heavy door closing with a boom that echoed in the small subterranean space. She was alone. The only light came from a single tall brazier, where fragrant oils burned with a steady, smokeless flame. The flame cast dancing shadows that made the chamber seem to breathe. In the center of the room, on a raised dais, sat the great golden tripod, its seat empty. Below it was a fissure in the rock, from which a faint, colorless vapor drifted upwards. The pneuma, the breath of the god. Elara felt a wave of dizziness and gripped her ewer tightly. She set to work, her movements small and precise. She poured the spring water onto a linen cloth and began to scrub at the dark, dried splash of goat's blood near the altar. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft hiss of the brazier and the whisper of her cloth on stone. It was a weighted silence, thick with unspoken words, with the echoes of 1,000 desperate questions asked in this very spot. As she knelt, scrubbing near the base of the dais, her fingers brushed against a section of the stonework that felt different. It was smoother, and the grout line was almost invisible. Curiosity, a trait the priests were constantly trying to scourge from her, flared hot and insistent. It was nothing, a repair, but her fingers traced it again. There was a subtle give, a minute shift that shouldn't have been there. Her gaze darted to the closed door. Lycomedes would be gone for at least the length of a water clock stripping. Her hands trembled, but she couldn't stop them. She pressed firmly on the edge of the stone. With a faint grating sound, barely audible over the fire, the stone block sank inwards and then slid to the side, revealing a dark, square cavity no bigger than a loaf of bread. A cold dread, slick as oil, coated her insides. This was sacrilege. She should push the stone back, finish her work, and forget she had ever seen it. But she couldn't. The darkness within the opening seemed to pull at her. Reaching in, her fingers brushed against something cool and cylindrical, wrapped in treated leather. It was heavy for its size. With another fearful glance at the door, she drew it out. It wasn't a scroll. It was a small cylinder of bronze, capped at both ends, the leather wrapping tied with a cord whose knot was sealed with a blob of blackened wax. The seal was unfamiliar, not the lyre of Apollo or the sunburst of the temple. It was a serpent, coiled and eating its own tail, Ouroboros, the symbol of eternity, of cycles, but here it felt like a warning, a prison. Her fingers, slick with nervous sweat, fumbled with the cord. The wax seal crumbled to dust under her thumbnail, a dust that felt unnervingly ancient. She worked the knot free and unwound the leather. The bronze cylinder felt cold, almost unnaturally so, leaching the warmth from her skin. One of the end caps twisted off with a faint metallic shriek. Inside, there was no papyrus. Instead, a single, thin sheet of hammered gold had been rolled into a tight scroll. It was covered in etched script, not the familiar flowing Greek of the temple records, but an older, sharper, more angular writing. It was the language of the Titans, the script of a forgotten age, a language she only knew because of old Philoxenus, the temple librarian who had a fondness for lost histories and saw a spark of intelligence in the orphaned acolyte. He had taught her the dead letters as a game, a secret between them before he had passed into the fields of asphodel last winter. She unrolled the delicate sheet. The gold glimmered in the brazier's light, the etched words seeming to drink the flame. Her eyes scanned the text, her mind slowly piecing together the archaic grammar, the terrible, world-shattering weight of the words. When the sun bleeds upon the twice-cleft peak, and the moon tastes of salt and sorrow, a child born of neither god nor Titan shall walk the silver path. They will seek the heart of the mountain, where the first breath was drawn and the last chain was forged. The chains of Tartarus shall sing a song of release at their touch, and the slumbering ones shall wake. The sky will weep fire, the seas will boil with forgotten rage, and the blood of the deathless, spilled upon the roots of the world, shall water the birth of a new age, the age of man, and Olympus shall be but a memory whispered on the wind. Elara felt the blood drain from her face. This was not a prophecy. It was a death warrant, not for a king or a city, but for the gods themselves. It was a blueprint for their destruction, a promise of their end. The Oracle of Delphi, the mouthpiece of Apollo, the source of divine will on earth, was hiding a secret that would unravel creation. A sudden, sharp rap on the cedar door made her jump so violently that the golden sheet slipped from her grasp. It rolled itself back into a coil with a soft metallic sigh. "Acolyte, are you finished?" Lycomedes' voice, muffled but sharp. Panic seized her. She couldn't leave it here. He would know. He would know someone had been in the hidden compartment. Her hands shook uncontrollably as she shoved the golden scroll back into its bronze tube, screwed on the cap, and thrust the cylinder back into the cavity. Her fingers fumbled with the stone block, trying to slide it back into place. It grated, loud in the silence, and settled with a soft click just as the key turned in the lock. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing her cloth and the ewer, her face a mask of feigned composure. The door swung open. Lycomedes stood there, his eyes sweeping the room, lingering on her face. "You are pale, girl," he stated, his voice flat. "Does the god's presence disturb you so?" "Yes, High Priest," she whispered, the lie sticking to her tongue. "It is overwhelming." His gaze was like a physical weight. He seemed to look right through her, to see the frantic beating of her heart, the terrible knowledge staining her soul. He took a step into the room, his nostrils flaring slightly, as if he could smell her fear. He walked slowly around the tripod, his sandals silent on the stone. He stopped near the dais, his eyes scanning the floor where she had been kneeling. For a heart-stopping moment, she was sure he would see the faint scrape marks, the disturbed dust around the hidden stone. But he just grunted, a non-committal sound, and gestured for her to leave. "Go, attend to your other duties, and speak of what you have felt in here to no one. The divine is not for the idle chatter of servants." Elara fled, her legs unsteady. She didn't stop until she was back in the open air of the main courtyard. The sun was higher now, casting a golden light on the temple columns, but it brought no warmth. The world looked the same, but it was utterly changed. The priests' chants sounded hollow. The petitioners' faces looked foolishly naive. They prayed for guidance on harvests and marriages to gods whose doom was written on a sheet of gold hidden a few feet from where they stood. The words of the prophecy burned behind her eyes. A child born of neither god nor titan. Who? When? The questions swirled in her mind, a vortex of terror and awe. She had stumbled upon the greatest secret in existence. Her duties were a blur, a series of mindless motions performed by a body that felt strangely disconnected from her own racing thoughts. She drew water, swept colonnades, polished bronze tripods meant for lesser offerings, all under the increasingly hot glare of the Hellenic sun. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every whisper of wind through the cypress trees sounded like a damning accusation. The world she had known, a world of rigid order and divine certainty, had cracked down the middle, and she was falling into the chasm. She needed to think, not here, not in the open where any pair of eyes could mark her distress. Making an excuse of fetching more polishing cloths, she slipped away from the main sanctuary and headed towards the one place that had ever offered her solace, the library. It was not a grand hall like the library at Alexandria she'd heard merchants whisper of, but a modest circular stone building tucked behind the treasury of the Athenians. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of aging papyrus and cedar oil. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light from the oculus in the ceiling. This was Philoxenus's domain, and since his death, it had become Elara's refuge. The priests saw little value in its crumbling scrolls and forgotten histories, leaving it largely undisturbed. She ran her hand along the spines of the scrolls stacked in their cubbyholes, the familiar texture a small comfort. It was here the old librarian had patiently guided her hand, teaching her the strokes of letters that had been dead for 1,000 years. "Words have power, little one," he used to say, his voice a dry rustle like turning pages. "Especially the words no one speaks anymore. They hold the world that was and the seeds of the world that will be." She found a secluded alcove and sank onto a low stool, the prophecy replaying in her mind, no longer a jumble of terrifying phrases, but a puzzle to be solved. When the sun bleeds upon the twice-cleft peak, that had to be Parnassus, whose twin peaks loomed over Delphi. A sunset, perhaps, or a more literal bloody omen. And the moon tastes of salt and sorrow, a poetic phrase for a tragedy occurring at sea or during a time of great weeping. "A child born of neither god nor titan shall walk the silver path." This was the heart of it. A mortal? A demigod was born of a god. But this child was neither. A human, then. Just a human, destined to topple the eternal. The silver path. She looked up at the painted ceiling, where a faint representation of the stars arced across the dome. The Milky Way, the path of souls. Her mind spun. It was too much. A prophecy of this magnitude couldn't have been written by any mortal hand. It felt older, more fundamental than the ravings of the Pythia, more absolute than the whims of Apollo. It was a truth set in stone, or rather, etched in gold. And the priests of Apollo, the god of prophecy himself, had hidden it. Why? To protect their master? To protect themselves? Or did they simply not believe it? A sharp clang from the courtyard startled her back to reality. The noon guard was changing. She had been away too long. Forcing her legs to move, she left the quiet dust of the library and stepped back into the blinding, vibrant present. A delegation had arrived. She could tell by the quality of the armor on the guards standing by the main temple entrance. Not the usual bronze cuirasses of the Phocian city-states, but darker, severe plates of iron-hardened bronze and lambda symbols painted on heavy shields. Spartans. They moved with an unnerving economy of motion, their eyes missing nothing. Elara instinctively lowered her gaze as she scurried past, making herself small and unimportant. "You look as if you've seen a ghost, little sparrow." The voice was low and calm. She looked up to see Cassandros, one of the younger temple guards, leaning against a pillar. He was polishing his helmet with a piece of oiled leather, his dark curls plastered to his forehead with sweat. Unlike the Spartans, his eyes held a familiar, weary warmth. "Just the sun," she murmured, shielding her eyes. "It's bright today." Cassandros grunted, not believing her for a moment. "It's the Spartans. They have that effect on people. They carry the chill of the river Styx with them." He nodded towards the temple. "Their general, Asiacellus, seeks guidance. War with Thebes again. They always want the gods to bless their spears, but never think to ask if the gods want the war in the first place." He paused, his polishing slowing. "Be careful today, Elara. When men like that come asking questions, the answers are often dangerous for everyone." His simple warning, a moment of human connection, felt both comforting and terrifying. It reminded her that the world of men and their wars churned on, oblivious to the deeper war she had just discovered. She gave him a weak, grateful smile and hurried on her way. Later, she was tasked with bringing cooled wine to the priests in the outer chamber as they awaited the Pythia's words. Through the gap in the heavy curtain, she could see the scene inside the temple proper. The Spartan general stood ramrod straight before the veiled entrance to the Aedaton, his face an impassive mask. Lycomedes was at his side, his expression pious and grave. The air was thick with the smoke of the sacrificial fires and the scent of crushed laurel. From within the sanctum came a low moan, then a sharp, guttural cry that did not sound human. The priests around Elara shifted, their faces a mixture of awe and fear. This was the moment of possession, when Apollo seized his vessel. Elara felt a cold knot form in her stomach. What was this, then? A carefully orchestrated play? If the god's true voice was locked away in a golden scroll, whose voice did these men hear? Lycomedes stepped forward, his voice booming in the cavernous space. "The Pythia speaks. Apollo grants his wisdom." A voice, high and discordant, shrieked from the Aedaton. "The wolf lunges from the shadow of the mountain. The lion's shield is splintered by its own pride. Beware the water that flows uphill." The general's stony expression didn't change, though a muscle twitched in his jaw. The priests began to murmur amongst themselves, dissecting the opaque phrases. A wolf for Thebes, a lion for Sparta, a warning of hubris, water flowing uphill, an unnatural event, a trap. It was the typical language of the oracle, vague, poetic, and malleable enough to fit whatever outcome occurred. Men would die based on these riddles. But Elara heard only the lie, A clever, well-rehearsed lie designed to keep kings and their gold flowing into Delphi's coffers. And hidden beneath it all, beneath the floor of the room where that woman was screaming, was the truth. The real, world-ending truth. After the Spartans had departed, clutching their ambiguous prophecy like a treasure, a strained quiet fell over the sanctuary. The acolytes began the work of cleaning up, clearing the offerings, and sweeping away the laurel leaves. Elara worked in a secluded portico, scrubbing soot from a marble bench when a shadow fell over her. "Leave that." It was Lycomedes. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face unreadable. Her heart began to pound a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. "Come with me, acolyte," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He led her not to the kitchens or the scriptorium, but to a small, private chamber behind the main altar, a room she had never been allowed to enter. It was bare, save for a single wooden table and 2 chairs. A single oil lamp burned, casting long, menacing shadows. He gestured for her to sit. She obeyed, her hands trembling in her lap. He sat opposite her, the table between them feeling as wide as a river. He said nothing for a long time, simply watching her. The silence was a weapon, and he wielded it with surgical precision. Elara tried to keep her breathing even, to empty her mind, but the words of the prophecy were a roaring fire in her skull. "Lyra's fever has worsened," he finally said, his voice soft, conversational. It was more frightening than if he had shouted. "The physicians say she may not last the night. It seems you may be tasked with cleansing the Aedaton for some time to come." Elara swallowed. "I pray for her recovery, High Priest." "Of course," he said, a faint, cold smile touching his lips. "This morning, in the sanctum, you were affected. I saw it on your face. You felt the divine presence, I am sure. But did you see anything? Anything unusual?" The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "No, High Priest, only as you said, the tripod, the altar, the floor." "The floor," he repeated, his gray eyes fixed on hers. "Just the mosaic of our Lord Apollo's victory? Nothing else? No loose stones? No ill-fitting repairs?" The blood rushed in her ears, a deafening roar. He knew. The thought was a shard of ice in her gut. This wasn't a random question. It was a test, a trap. I was focused on my task, High Priest. I did not inspect the stonework." The lie felt clumsy, fragile. Lycomedes leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "There are many secrets in this temple, girl, many layers of history, one built upon the other. Some secrets are meant to protect the faithful from truths they cannot comprehend. Others are meant to protect the gods themselves. They are secured by wards, by locks, and by seals. Ancient seals. Have you ever seen the Ouroboros, the serpent that consumes itself?" He knew. He knew about the seal. He had not just stumbled upon her discovery. He had been waiting for someone to make it. Her terror was no longer a vague dread, but a sharp, piercing certainty. She had not found a secret. She had walked into a cage that had been left open for her. "Tell me, Elara," Lycomedes continued, his voice as smooth and deadly as polished stone. "What the serpent told you." The air left Elara's lungs in a silent rush. It was not a question. It was a command. The chamber, which had seemed merely austere, now felt like a tomb. Her carefully constructed lie about not noticing the loose stone lay in ruins at her feet. There was no escape. The path behind her had vanished, and the one ahead led into shadow. She stared at the grain of the wooden table, unable to meet his gaze. Her mind, a moment ago a maelstrom of panic, went unnervingly still. The terror was so absolute, it had become a strange kind of clarity. Lying further was pointless. He had orchestrated this. The sick priestess, the sudden honor, the specific timing, it was all a stage, and she had played her part perfectly. I read the words, she finally whispered, her voice a thread of sound. On the gold. Lycomedes leaned back, the barest hint of satisfaction in the grim set of his mouth. And you understood them. Philoxenus taught you well. I always thought the old man's obsession with dead languages was a harmless eccentricity. It seems the fates had a purpose for it, after all. He had known about her lessons. He had been watching her for years. The realization was another cold weight added to the crushing burden in her chest. She had thought herself invisible, a nameless orphan scuttling through the daily rituals. Instead, she had been a piece on a game board, moved into position without her knowledge. That prophecy, he said, his voice lowering, is not of Apollo. It does not belong to the Olympians. It is a relic of the previous age, a sliver of the old chaos that the gods thought they had buried. We, the inner circle of this temple, have been its guardians for generations. We do not guard it for Apollo's sake. We guard it for the sake of the world. He rose and began to pace the small room, his robes rustling like dry leaves. The Pythia you saw today? A necessary performance, a comfort for kings, and a source of revenue for the sanctuary. She inhales the vapors, she speaks riddles, and men find the meaning they wish to find. It is a useful, harmless deception. But the golden scroll, that is truth. A truth so potent it would burn the world to ash if it were ever brought into the light. He stopped and turned to face her, his shadow cast long and sharp by the lamp. For centuries, the high priests have debated its meaning. Some believed it should be destroyed, cast into the fires of a volcano, others that it must be preserved at all costs as a warning. I belong to a third school of thought. I believe it must be understood, controlled. Elara finally found the courage to look up at him. Why me? She asked, the words raw. Why show it to me? Because you are nothing, he said, the words striking her with the force of a physical blow. You are an orphan, of no bloodline. You have no family to leverage against you, no allies to run to. You are intelligent, but you are powerless. And, because of Philoxenus, you possess a skill we desperately need. The script on that scroll is complex. Our translations are incomplete, riddled with debate. We need a fresh eye, an untainted mind. He paused, his gaze intensifying. And there is the prophecy itself. A child born of neither god nor titan. It describes a mortal, an ordinary human, perhaps one who seems as insignificant as a temple servant. The implication hung in the air between them, monstrous and suffocating. He was testing her, seeing if the prophecy resonated with her, if she could be its subject. I am no one, she said, shaking her head, a genuine, desperate plea in her voice. I am just a girl who sweeps the floors. The greatest changes are often wrought by the hands of those the world deems no one, Lycomedes countered smoothly. But whether you are the subject of the prophecy or merely its translator is, for now, irrelevant. What matters is that you have read it. The knowledge is inside you now, a seed of chaos. I can either let that seed grow wild, or I can cultivate it. He returned to his seat and folded his hands on the table. You have two paths before you, Elara. On one, you will be taken to the cliffs behind the sanctuary. Your death will be a tragic accident, a slip on the rocks. The girl who saw too much, silenced before she could speak. Your memory will fade within a week. He let the image settle, stark and brutal. Elara could almost feel the sharp rocks, the endless fall. On the other path, he continued, you become more than an acolyte. You will work with me, in secret. You will study the scroll. You will help me unravel every last syllable of its meaning. You will have access to the library, to any text you require. You will be protected. You will be important. In return, you will swear an unbreakable oath of silence. You will belong to me and to this secret. You will speak of it to no one, not to the other acolytes, not to the guards, not even to the gods in your prayers. It was no choice at all. It was a death sentence or a gilded cage. She thought of Cassandros, his easy smile and kind warning. She thought of the simple, predictable ache in her back from a day of honest work. That world was gone forever. I will serve the temple, she stammered, choosing the only words she could find, choosing life. You will serve the truth, Lycomedes corrected her, a far heavier burden. He gave a curt nod, the matter settled. From tomorrow, your duties will change. You will be assigned to the library to assist in cataloging old texts. No one will question it. You will report to me, and only to me, at the end of each day. He stood, signaling the end of their meeting. As Elara rose on shaky legs, a commotion from the courtyard filtered through the stone walls, raised voices, the clang of metal on metal. Lycomedes frowned, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features. He moved to the chamber's narrow window slit and peered out. Aegis Alawis, he muttered, his voice laced with contempt. The Spartan is not satisfied with his riddles, it seems. He demands a clearer sign. Elara's blood ran cold. The Spartans were still here. She had a sudden, vivid image of their hard, merciless faces, their iron-hardened bronze armor. They were men who dealt in absolutes, in victory and death, not in secrets and shadows. If they ever learned what she knew. Go now, Lycomedes commanded, turning from the window. He grabbed a small, heavy pouch from his belt and tossed it onto the table. It landed with a soft metallic clink. This is for you. Buy yourself a new cloak, a warmer blanket. See to it that you look like someone who has earned a promotion, not a girl who has seen a ghost. He opens the door, and the sounds of the temple at night flooded in, the distant chant of the evening prayers, the chirping of crickets, the uneasy murmur from the courtyard. Remember your oath, Elara. From this moment on, every word you speak is a matter of life and death, not just your own. She stumbled out of the chamber, her hand clutching the small pouch of coins, her mind reeling. The familiar flagstones of the sanctuary felt alien beneath her sandals. She was walking through the same space, but she was a different person. The girl who entered that room was gone. In her place was a conspirator, a keeper of a secret that could unmake the heavens. She avoided the main courtyard, taking the long way around through the shadowed colonnades. She saw Cassandros jogging towards the disturbance, his helmet on, his hand on the hilt of his sword. He didn't even glance her way. She was already becoming invisible, in a new way, hidden not by her lowly status, but by the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what she knew. Back in the small shared dormitory for the junior acolytes, she lay on her thin straw mattress, listening to the soft breathing of the other girls. They dreamed of simple things, a kind word from a priestess, an extra portion of figs at dinner. Elara stared into the darkness, the etched words of the golden scroll burning bright against the back of her eyelids. She was trapped by Lycomedes, trapped by the prophecy. But as the initial wave of terror began to recede, something else, something hard and cold, began to form in its place. Lycomedes had called her powerless, nothing. He thought he could use her, control her. He was wrong. Knowledge, Philoxenus had taught her, was power. And she now possessed the most powerful knowledge in the world. She did not know what she would do with it. But as she finally drifted into a restless, nightmare-filled sleep, she knew one thing for certain. She would not be a pawn in anyone's game for long. The next morning, the world had been rearranged. The other acolytes, who had once shared a bond of common drudgery with her, now looked at her with a mixture of envy and suspicion. When the priestess Theano announced that Elara was being reassigned to the library to assist with the recataloguing of the old histories, a task deemed both prestigious and mind-numbingly dull, whispers followed her like a cloud of gnats. Lycomedes himself chose her, a girl named Chloe hissed to another, just loud enough for Elara to hear. What did she do to earn such favor? The pouch of coins felt like a lead weight in the folds of her peplos. Following Lycomedes' instruction, she went to the small market that served the sanctuary and its pilgrims. She bought a new cloak of dark wool, thicker and warmer than her old one, and a small loaf of bread with honey, a luxury she hadn't tasted in years. The wool was soft against her skin, but it felt like a brand, marking her as different. The honey tasted of ash in her mouth. Every simple act was now tainted by the secret she carried. The library became her prison and her sanctuary. The scent of ancient papyrus was a comforting balm, a sharp contrast to the cloying laurel smoke that seemed to permeate the rest of Delphi. Her official task was tedious, sorting through crumbling scrolls of tax records from forgotten city-states and third-rate copies of Homeric hymns. But it provided the perfect cover. When the library was empty, during the sun-drenched peak of the afternoon, when most sought shade or a siesta, her real work began. She dared not bring the golden scroll to the library. Instead, she had spent the darkest hours of the night before, huddled under her thin blanket, committing its terrible words to memory. The archaic Titan script was seared into her mind. Now, surrounded by the words of men, she began her hunt. Lycomedes wanted her to unravel the prophecy's meaning, but Elara had a more pressing goal. She needed to understand the prophecy better than he did. Her survival depended on it. She started with the first lines. When the sun bleeds upon the twice-cleft peak. She found astronomical charts, records of celestial omens. There were mentions of red sunsets before battles, of eclipses that stained the sky crimson. They were common portents, nothing specific. And the moon tastes of salt and sorrow. She searched for references to naval disasters, to coastal cities lost to earthquakes or plagues. The library was full of such tragedies. The prophecy remained stubbornly vague, a tapestry of poetic doom. It was on the third day that her solitude was broken. The heavy oak door of the library swung open, letting in a blinding rectangle of sunlight. A figure stood silhouetted against it, broad-shouldered and radiating an aura of disciplined violence. A Spartan. He was younger than the general, his face clean-shaven in their severe tradition, with eyes the color of a winter sea. He scanned the room, his gaze finally settling on her. "I was told I could find maps here," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the musicality of the local Phocian dialect. Elara's heart leaped into her throat. She forced herself to remain calm, to be the unassuming acolyte. "We have some, Lord. What region do you seek?" "Boeotia, the mountain passes near Thebes." He walked towards her, his movements silent and predatory despite the heavy bronze greaves on his legs. He stopped a few feet from her small work table, his shadow falling over the mundane tax scroll she had been pretending to read. His eyes weren't just looking at her. They were assessing her, noting the new cloak, the ink stains on her fingers, the slight tremor she couldn't completely hide. "I am Damon," he said, an unnecessary introduction that was clearly a test. "Aide to General Azalias." Elara, she replied, keeping her eyes downcast, a servant of the temple. She led him to an alcove where the geographical scrolls were kept. As she searched for the correct one, she could feel his gaze on her back, as sharp as a spear point. He was not a man who believed in simple servants. In his world, everyone and everything had a purpose, a potential use, or a potential threat. The High Priest Lycomedes keeps a tight rein on this place, Damon remarked, though his tone was anything but. He seems a man who values knowledge. He is the voice of the god, Lord. Knowledge is his sacred duty, Elara recited, the words feeling hollow and false. The god gave my general a riddle, Damon said, taking the scroll she offered, his fingers brushing hers. His skin was calloused and cool. We Spartans prefer straight answers. Riddles leave room for error, and in our profession, errors are paid for in blood. He unrolled the map, but his eyes flicked up to meet hers. You spend your days with old words, acolyte. Tell me, do you find more truth in these dusty scrolls, or in the ones the Pythia screams in the dark? It was a barb, sharp, and aimed directly at the heart of the temple's authority. The Spartans were not pleased. Their dissatisfaction was a dangerous, unpredictable variable. The words of the god are not for me to interpret, she said, her voice steady despite the frantic pounding of her pulse. I only read the words of men. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a wise answer. He studied the map for a moment longer, then rolled it back up with deft, powerful hands. We will be in Delphi for some time. The general seeks a more clarifying vision. Perhaps I will have more questions about the words of men for you later. He left as silently as he had arrived, leaving Elara with trembling hands and a new layer of seer. The Spartans were not just petitioners, they were sniffing around the edges of the great lie, and she was now, however peripherally, a part of it. That night, a summons came. Not a spoken word, but a small, smooth black stone left on her bedding. It was the signal. She waited until the dormitory was deep in slumber, then slipped out into the moonlit sanctuary. The air was cool and carried the scent of pine from the slopes of Parnassus. The stone directed her to the western portico, a place rarely used at night. Lycomedes was waiting in the shadows of the columns, indistinguishable from them until he moved. You were visited today, he stated, his voice a low whisper. The Spartan, Damon. What did he want? A map of Boeotia. He asked probing questions about the Pythia, about truth. Lycomedes made a dismissive sound. The Spartans are dogs who only understand the whip and the sword. They are an annoyance, nothing more. Forget them. Tell me what you have found. The prophecy. What have the scrolls told you? Very little, Elara admitted, her frustration real. The celestial signs, the tragedies, they could refer to 100 different moments in history, or none at all. The language is deliberately opaque. It is not opaque, Lycomedes countered, stepping closer. The moonlight caught the silver threads in his beard. It is precise. We are simply too ignorant to understand the context. You are looking at the branches. I want you to look at the roots. He gestured towards the towering mass of the mountain behind them. They will seek the heart of the mountain, where the first breath was drawn and the last chain was forged. For centuries, my predecessors have sought this heart. They have explored every known cave, every grotto. They have sacrificed countless animals on the slopes, trying to divine a location. They found nothing. Perhaps it is not a physical place, Elara suggested, the thought forming even as she spoke it. Explain? The first breath could be the pneuma, the vapor in the adiaton that gives the Pythia her visions. The last chain forged? I don't know. But the heart of the mountain might be a metaphor, a secret place, not a geographic one. Lycomedes was silent for a long moment, studying her face in the gloom. A secret place, he repeated slowly, like a hidden chamber, under the very feet of the god's vessel. The parallel was not lost on him. This is why I chose you, Elara. You see with fresh eyes. The rest of us are blind, stumbling in the footsteps of our ancestors. Continue this line of thought. Do not look for places, look for knowledge. The library is filled with texts deemed heretical or dangerous by the early priests, histories of the Titanomachy, forbidden cosmologies, texts that speak of the world before the Olympians. The prophecy is a key. I want you to find the lock it fits. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip surprisingly strong, almost painful. You are doing well. You are proving your worth. But do not forget your position. The Spartan, Damon, if he speaks to you again, you will tell me every word. Men like him are a threat, not because of their strength, but because they do not believe. Unbelief is a crack in the foundation of our world, and our world, girl, is already fragile enough. He released her and melted back into the shadows, leaving her alone with the silent columns and the immense, crushing weight of her task. She was no longer just a translator. She was a hunter, stalking a truth hidden in a forest of lies, and she was beginning to suspect that Lycomedes was not the only hunter in the woods. The Spartans were prowling the edges, and Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that if she was caught between them, she would be torn apart. The lock Lycomedes had described was not a physical one of bronze or iron, but one of neglect. Behind a row of dusty amphorae containing brittle land deeds from the Archaic Age, she found a section of the wall where the plaster had crumbled away, revealing a dark cavity. It was not a grand hidden chamber, but a simple recess, a loculus stuffed with scrolls deemed too dangerous to catalog, but too significant to burn. Pulling one out, she felt a different texture, not the smooth grain of papyrus, but the rough, stiff surface of cured animal hide. The air it displaced smelled of dust and heresy. Unrolling it carefully, she saw diagrams of the cosmos that placed the Earth not as the navel of the world, but as a small sphere adrift in a vast star-filled void. Another scroll argued that the gods were not eternal beings, but powerful entities born of celestial alignments, destined to fade as the stars shifted. This was the knowledge Lycomedes had spoken of, the cracks in the world's foundation. It was intoxicating and terrifying. She spent hours cross-referencing names and places, looking for anything that echoed the prophecy's cadence. She found countless mentions of Tartarus, of the 100-handed Hecatonchires who guarded its gates, of the chains that bound Kronos and the other vanquished titans. But the phrase, "the last chain was forged," eluded her. It felt specific, an event singular and final, yet it was absent from every creation myth and Titanomachy account she could find. Her concentration was so absolute that she didn't hear the footsteps until they stopped. Her head snapped up, her heart seizing in her chest. Damon stood at the entrance to the alcove, his arms crossed over his iron-hardened cuirass. The afternoon light behind him cast his face in shadow, but she could feel the intensity of his gaze. He wasn't holding a map. He was just watching her. "More dusty words, acolyte?" he asked, his voice a low rumble that seemed to absorb the library's silence. He took a step closer, his eyes flicking from her face to the strange, stiff scroll spread across her table. "These look older than the others, more valuable." Elara's mind raced, searching for a plausible lie. "The High Priest has tasked me with finding texts related to the temple's founding. Some of the older records were misplaced." Misplaced, Damon repeated, the single word dripping with disbelief. He walked around the table, forcing her to turn to keep him in her sights. He was circling her like a wolf. I spoke with one of the junior priestesses this morning, a talkative girl named Chloe. She told me the priestess Lyra, the one who cleansed the inner sanctum, is dead. The fever took her in the night. Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool stone. Lyra was dead. The convenient illness became a convenient death. The last person who could have contradicted the official reason for Elara's presence in the Autoton was gone. A tragedy for the temple, Elara murmured, her mouth dry. Indeed, Damon said, stopping directly opposite her. It is also a remarkable coincidence. The one person whose task you inherited dies, and you are promoted to a position of trust by the High Priest, given access to the temple's deepest secrets. He gestured to the scroll. Tell me, Elara, what founding history requires such secrecy? I am only a servant. I follow the High Priest's orders, she said, clutching the words like a shield. Lycomedes' orders, Damon mused, his eyes narrowing. My general offered a fortune in gold for a clear answer from the god. He was refused. Yet you, a girl with nothing, are given the keys to the kingdom. It makes a man wonder what you offered him. The insinuation was crude, meant to provoke her, to make her angry and careless. She felt a flash of heat in her cheeks, but forced it down, meeting his cold gaze with a carefully constructed mask of pious innocence. I offered my obedience. It is all I have to give. For a long moment, they were locked in a silent battle of wills. He was searching for a crack in her composure, and she was desperately trying to show him there was nothing to find. Finally, with a sigh that was half frustration, half grudging respect, he relented. Be careful, servant, he said, his tone shifting from accusatory to something more akin to a warning. Men like Lycomedes do not give gifts. They make investments, and they always expect to be repaid. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room, leaving Elara's heart hammering against her ribs. The encounter left her badly shaken, but also sharpened her resolve. Damon was not an idle threat. He was actively investigating, pulling at the loose threads of the temple's fabric. She had less time than she thought. She turned back to the scrolls, her hands trembling slightly. She pushed aside the cosmological texts and looked for something more practical, more grounded. If a chain had been forged, who would have forged it? Hephaestus, the smith god. But he worked on Olympus, or in the fiery heart of volcanoes. His work was the stuff of grand myth. This felt different, more hidden. She found it near the bottom of the pile, a scroll bound not with cord, but with a strip of fire-blackened leather. It was a partial record, a copy of a logbook from a forgotten forge cult, followers of the lesser smiths and artisans who served Hephaestus. Much of it was a dry accounting of bronze ingots and charcoal supplies. But then, a section of the text changed. The script became more hurried, more secretive. The master calls for a final work, not for Olympus, not for the underworld. A secret task for the protector of Delphi himself. We are taken to a hidden place, a wound in the rock beneath the sacred mountain, a place that smells of the void. We are to forge a chain, but not of bronze or iron. The links are to be of celestial ore, star metal, quenched not in water, but in the silence between breaths. It is a chain to bind not flesh, but thought, to hold not a body, but a name. The sleeper must not wake. The name must not be spoken. The forge will be destroyed. We will be sworn to an eternity of silence. This is the last entry. This is the last chain. Elara stared at the words, her breath caught in her throat. This was it. The heart of the mountain was not a metaphor. It was a real place, a prison.
And the last chain was not for a titan of myth, but for something else. A being so feared its very name was forbidden, imprisoned beneath Delphi itself by Apollo, the protector of Delphi. The prophecy was not about releasing the titans from Tartarus. It was about opening this other, more secret prison. The pneuma in the Ataton, was it the breath of Apollo? Or the exhalation of this sleeper? The black stone was on her pillow that night. When she met Lycomedes in the echoing darkness of the treasury, the cold of the gold and silver ingots stacked in the vaults seemed to seep into her bones. "Report," he commanded, his voice sharp with impatience. This was the moment, the pivot point. She could tell him everything, hand him the key he so desperately sought, and in doing so, bind herself to him completely. Or she could hold something back. She could forge her own key. "I found several heretical cosmologies, as you predicted," she began, her voice even and measured, "and many references to the Titanomachy. The phrase, 'the last chain,' appears to be a poetic descriptor for the final binding of Kronos in Tartarus. It is used in a few obscure hymns to signify the end of the war and the establishment of the Olympian order." She watched his face carefully. It was a plausible, scholarly interpretation. It was the answer his predecessors had likely settled on, and it was a complete lie. A flicker of disappointment crossed Lycomedes' features. "That is all? A poetic turn of phrase? It feels too simple, too small for a prophecy of this magnitude." "Perhaps its significance is not in its literal meaning, but in its timing," Elara offered, weaving a more complex web. "By referencing the end of the First Great War, it may herald the beginning of the last one. It could be the trigger, the symbolic marker for when the other conditions of the prophecy are met." Lycomedes stroked his beard, considering her words. She was giving him an interpretation, something to work with, but not the raw, actionable truth she had discovered. She was keeping the sleeper, the celestial chain, and the hidden prison to herself. They were her only assets in this deadly game. "A symbolic marker," he mused. "Yes, that has merit. Continue your search. There must be more." He seemed placated, for now. As he turned to dismiss her, he paused. "The Spartans grow restless. Agelias has sworn not to leave until he receives a sign he can understand. They defile the sanctuary with their arrogance and their doubt."
"Be wary of the one called Damon. He has a dangerous curiosity." "He came to the library again," Elara said, offering a piece of the truth to sweeten her lie. "He told me the priestess Lyra is dead." Lycomedes did not flinch. Her piety has been rewarded. The gods have called her home. It is of no consequence. He waved a dismissive hand. "He is trying to unnerve you. Pay him no mind. You belong to the temple now. You belong to me. No Spartan dog can touch you." As she walked back through the sleeping sanctuary, his words echoed in her mind. "You belong to me." He was wrong. From the moment she had decided to lie, she belonged only to herself. She carried the truth of the sleeper locked in her heart, a secret within a secret, and she knew, with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty, that she was no longer searching for the lock that the prophecy fit. She was searching for the key that opened the prison. The lie was a living thing inside her now, a creature with its own weight and warmth. It coiled in her gut during the day as she sorted through scrolls, and it whispered to her in the darkness of the dormitory. She had fed it to Lycomedes, and he had swallowed it whole, but she knew it was a starving beast. It would need to be fed again and again. Her work in the library changed. She no longer searched for the meaning of the prophecy's words, but for the location of its subject. A wound in the rock beneath the sacred mountain. The logbook of the Forge cult was her only guide, a fragile map to a place that had been deliberately erased from history. She began pulling architectural plans of the sanctuary, diagrams of aqueducts, and surveys of the mountain's foundations, claiming to Lycomedes that she was searching for symbolic alignments mentioned in the heretical cosmologies. It was a thin excuse, but the high priest, consumed with his own theories of symbolic triggers, accepted it. 2 days after her confrontation with Damon, the sanctuary began to buzz with a new energy. Chloe, the acolyte whose gossip was as reliable as the sunrise, cornered Elara by the well, her eyes wide with excitement. "Have you heard? The High Priest is going to perform the rite of celestial appeasement tonight for the Spartans," she whispered, splashing water on the flagstones. "They say an eagle will descend at the peak of the rite and take a consecrated offering from the great altar, a sign of Apollo's favor for their war." Elara's blood went cold. A trained eagle? A theatrical trick to placate the impatient general and his suspicious aide. It was a dangerous, desperate move by Lycomedes. It was also an opportunity. The entire sanctuary, from the lowest acolyte to the high priest himself, would be gathered in the main precinct, their eyes turned to the sky. No one would be watching the temple's inner chambers. No one would be guarding the Adaton. The thought was a bolt of lightning. To go back in there, willingly, was madness. But the Forge Cult's log had described the prison as a wound in the rock that smells of the void. The pneuma that rose from the fissure in the Adaton's floor? What if it wasn't the breath of a god, but the exhalation of a prisoner? She had to know. That evening, as the sun began its spectacular death bleed across the twin peaks of Parnassus, the sanctuary gathered. Torches were lit, casting the marble columns in flickering shades of orange and black. The air grew thick with the scent of expensive cedar incense and the nervous sweat of the assembled crowd. The Spartans stood apart, a block of obsidian muscle and bronze, their faces grim and unimpressed. Agesilaus stood at the front, his arms crossed, while Damon scanned the crowd, his gaze sweeping over the acolytes, lingering for a half-second when it passed Elara. She quickly looked away, her heart thudding a nervous rhythm. Lycomedes was in his element. Dressed in robes of pure white and gold, he ascended the steps of the great outdoor altar, his voice booming across the precinct as he began the long, solemn invocation to Apollo. It was the perfect diversion. Elara, tasked with holding a reserve torch near the back, waited for her moment. As Lycomedes raised his hands to the sky, beginning the most dramatic part of the chant, she let her torch slip, extinguishing it on the stone flags. Under the cover of a muttered apology and the scolding glance of a senior priestess, she melted back into the deep shadows of a colonnade. No one noticed. All eyes were on the altar, waiting for their miracle. Her bare feet made no sound on the cool stone as she slipped through a side entrance into the temple. The interior was vast and empty, the lingering smell of the day's sacrifices hanging in the still air. Her destination lay ahead, behind the heavy cedar door. She had no key, but she had watched Lycomedes. She knew there was a smaller, simpler bolt on the inside used by the Pythia, and the door was rarely locked from the outside between petitioners. She prayed to whatever gods might be listening that tonight was no different. The handle turned. The door swung inward with a low groan. She slipped inside, pulling it shut behind her, plunging the world into absolute silence and darkness. For a moment, she stood, letting her eyes adjust. Then she saw it. The single, eternal flame of the brazier, its light a lonely sentinel in the subterranean chamber. The great golden tripod sat gleaming, a silent throne. Below it, the fissure in the rock seemed darker than the shadows around it. Her fear was a physical presence, a cold hand on the back of her neck. But the memory of the forge log pushed her forward. She knelt by the dais, just as she had that first morning. This time, she wasn't looking for loose stones. She leaned over the fissure, her face inches from the rock. The faint, colorless vapor drifted up, and she caught its scent again. Ozone, deep earth, and that wild metallic tang. But there was something else, too. An utter coldness that had nothing to do with the subterranean air. It was a coldness of the soul, a profound and absolute emptiness. She reached out a trembling hand, holding it over the rising pneuma. It felt like dipping her fingers in a frozen river. There was no divine warmth, no sense of Apollo's sun-blessed presence. There was only a vibration, a faint, deep thrumming that resonated not in her ears, but directly in the bones of her skull. Instinct, or some deeper compulsion, made her close her eyes and listen. She pushed aside the booming echo of Lycomedes' chanting from the courtyard above and focused on the thrumming silence. And then she felt it. It was not a voice. It was not a word. It was a shape. A thought, ancient and vast, impressed itself upon her mind. It was a feeling of immense, geological patience, of a consciousness that measured time in the grinding of tectonic plates. And with it came a flicker of an image, a symbol, not a letter from any alphabet she knew, but a complex, crystalline shape of impossible geometry that seemed to turn itself inside out as she perceived it. It was a name, but a name that could not be spoken, only understood. The Sleeper. A sudden, sharp clang from outside the Ataton shattered the connection. Elara gasped, stumbling back, the image in her mind dissolving like smoke. The sound had come from the temple proper. Footsteps, heavy, measured. Someone was inside. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. It couldn't be Lycomedes. He was at the altar. It had to be a guard. Or worse. She scrambled away from the fissure, pressing herself into the deepest shadow behind the dais. The footsteps grew closer. The main cedar door, which she had not fully latched, was pushed open. A figure stepped through, not into the Ataton, but pausing in the small antechamber just outside it. She could see his silhouette against the distant torchlight filtering in from the main temple hall. Broad shoulders, the unmistakable outline of a Spartan helmet held in the crook of an arm. Damon. He stood perfectly still, listening. He had heard something. The scuff of her sandal, her gasp. He took a slow step towards the Ataton door. Elara held her breath, her body rigid, convinced he would see her, that it was all over. Then, from the courtyard, a great collective gasp from the crowd, followed by a roar of approval. The eagle! Lycomedes' trick had worked. The sound drew Damon's attention. He hesitated, looking back towards the source of the noise. The moment of decision stretched into an eternity. For a Spartan, his duty was to his general. His curiosity was his own. Duty won. He turned and strode away, his footsteps receding, leaving Elara alone once more in the vibrating silence. She sagged against the cold stone, her legs too weak to hold her. The crystalline name still echoed in the back of her mind, a terrifying and powerful secret. She now knew with absolute certainty that the prophecy was real. A living, breathing consciousness was chained beneath her feet. She fled the sanctum, her path back to the ceremony a blur of moonshadow and fear. She slipped back into her place just as the crowd was beginning to disperse, their faces full of awe. Lycomedes was descending the altar steps, his expression one of triumphant piety. His eyes, however, were not on the adoring crowd. They were sweeping the shadows, and as they found her, a small, knowing smile touched his lips. He knew she had been gone. He didn't know where or why, but he knew. She had survived the night, but she had been marked. She was no longer just a pawn. She was a player who had made her first move, and the other pieces on the board were starting to take notice. Her secret was no longer just a burden, it was a weapon. And she was beginning to understand that in Delphi, the only way to avoid being sacrificed was to be the one holding the knife. Lycomedes' knowing smile was a brand seared into her memory. For the next 2 days, she lived in a state of suspended dread, expecting a summons at any moment. She forced herself to maintain her routine, to methodically sort through scrolls in the library, her every nerve screaming. The High Priest was a patient man. He was letting her terror marinate, letting her imagine every possible punishment until the reality, whatever it might be, would seem almost a relief. The summons came, as she knew it would, as a black stone on her cot. This time, the meeting place was different. Not the sterile interrogation room or the shadowed portico, but the treasury of the Athenians, a small, ornate building filled with the spoils of past victories. Lycomedes stood before a display of captured Persian shields, their bronze warped and scarred by battle. The light from a single, tall candelabra cast his shadow over the relics of a fallen empire. The Spartans were pleased, he began, not turning to look at her. His voice was dangerously mild. Agesilaus saw his eagle. He has the sign he needs to march his men to their deaths. Gods, but kings are such children. They crave bedtime stories. He finally turned, his eyes pinning her in place. You, however, were not present for the climax of the tale. You missed the miracle. Elara had rehearsed this. She had built her lie from the strongest material she could find, his own words and his own ego. A passage I read spoke of the temple's first foundation, the one laid before the Great Rockslide. It described the original spring of the Castalian fountain as being aligned with the chamber of the first Pythia. I thought, if the heart of the mountain you spoke of was a physical place, its entrance might be near that original foundation. When the entire sanctuary was distracted, it seemed the only time I could investigate the western wall without being seen. She held his gaze, her heart a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She had woven a thread of truth, the western wall, into a blanket of deceit. Lycomedes was silent for a long time. He walked over to a marble plinth displaying a captured Persian helmet. He ran a finger along a deep gash in the bronze. You acted on your own initiative. You took a risk, a great risk. He looked at her, and she saw not anger, but a flicker of something else in his eyes, assessment. And what did you find at this western wall, acolyte? Nothing, she said, letting a note of genuine frustration enter her voice. The stones are ancient, but the masonry is seamless. There is no sign of a hidden entrance. I was wrong. No, Lycomedes said softly, turning back to the helmet. You were not wrong. You were resourceful. You have begun to think not as a servant, but as a seeker of the truth. That is good. That is what I require. He had not only believed her lie, he had reframed it as a virtue. The relief that washed over Elara was so profound it left her dizzy. But do not do it again, he added, his voice hardening to iron. Your mind is your tool. Your body is mine to command. You will go where I tell you to go. Your safety, and therefore the safety of this great work, depends on your obedience. Is that clear? Yes, High Priest. Good. Return to your studies. The Spartans will likely depart within the day. Our sanctuary will soon be cleansed of their abrasive presence. Cleansed. The word hung in the air, as sterile and final as the death of the priestess Lyra. Elara fled back to the library, the lie still tasting sour on her tongue. She had won a reprieve, but she knew she had only pushed the blade closer to her own throat. She had bought herself time, and she could not afford to waste a second of it. She abandoned the architectural scrolls and returned to the loculus, the recess of forbidden texts. The forge log was burned into her memory, a chain to bind not flesh but thought, to hold not a body but a name. She unrolled a scroll of stiff, dark hide that felt far older than the others. The script was an early Proto-Arcadian form Philoxenus had only briefly touched upon. It spoke of the age before the Titans, when the cosmos was not a struggle between anthropomorphic gods, but a war of pure concepts. It described entities of mathematics, beings of sound, consciousnesses that existed as living paradoxes. It called them the apeiron, the unbound. According to the text, their very existence defied the principles of order that the Titans and later the Olympians sought to impose. They could not be killed, as they were not truly alive. They could not be imprisoned, as they had no physical form. But the scroll described one way to control them, to discover their true name, not a word, but a conceptual shape or frequency that defined their existence, and to bind that name to a fixed point in physical reality. To chain the name was to anchor the unmoored consciousness. The crystalline geometric shape she had perceived in the Ataton was not a symbol. It was the sleeper itself, its core identity. And Apollo, or some earlier power, had managed to forge a conceptual chain and anchor it deep within the mountain. The prophecy wasn't about a simple jailbreak. It was about unnaming a being of pure chaos, releasing it back into the fabric of creation. The world outside the library walls seemed to fade into a foolish dream. The squabbles of Sparta and Thebes were like the games of ants played in the shadow of a tidal wave. Lycomedes believed he was trying to control a prophecy that could destroy the gods. Elara now understood the truth was far worse. This wasn't about destroying the Olympians. It was about rendering them, and the entire reality they governed, utterly irrelevant. Her next encounter with Damon came in the one place she felt most exposed, the market outside the sanctuary gates. Lycomedes had given her another small pouch of coins, insisting she maintain the appearance of a favored servant. As she was bartering for a small clay pot of ink, a voice spoke from beside her. "I hear your high priest put on a fine show for my general." Damon stood there, out of his armor for the first time. He wore a simple gray chiton, the rough wool doing little to hide the disciplined power of his physique. He looked less like a soldier and more like a wolf trying to pass as a sheepdog. "The god showed his favor," Elara said, turning her attention back to the inkpot. "The god, or a man with a well-trained bird," he countered, his voice low. He picked up a small ripe fig from the merchant's stall. "We are leaving at dawn. Agesilas has what he came for, but I do not." He tossed a coin to the merchant and handed the fig to Elara, a gift. She hesitated, then took it. To refuse would be an insult, and she could not afford to make him more of an enemy. "Why are you telling me this, Lord?" "Because I do not believe you are a willing piece in his game," Damon said, his winter-sea eyes fixed on her. "I have seen girls like you before, in the cities we liberate. Quiet ones who see everything, the ones who survive. Lycomedes thinks he found a tool. I think he found a knife that has not yet decided which way to cut." He lowered his voice further, leaning closer, as if inspecting the merchant's wares. "We found something on our patrols in the mountains. An old path, nearly overgrown, leading to a collapsed cave. There were strange markings on the rocks at the entrance. Not letters, shapes. My men thought them nothing, but I have seen similar carvings on pre-Hellenic ruins in the Peloponnese. Ancient, powerful symbols. The path begins behind the western retaining wall of the sanctuary." Elara's blood turned to ice. The western wall. Her lie to Lycomedes. It wasn't a lie at all. There was something there. Damon was giving her a piece of the puzzle, a piece he could not use himself, but suspected she could. It was a test, a lure, and a warning all in one. "I do not know what you mean," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I think you do," he said. He gave her a final appraising look. "Sparta may have its answers, but the truth of this place remains buried. Be careful who you trust with the shovel." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the throng of pilgrims. Elara was left standing with the fig in her hand, its sweetness a cloying contrast to the cold fear and sudden blazing hope that filled her. A path, a collapsed cave, markings. The Forge cult's log had said the forge would be destroyed. That night, sleep was impossible.
She did not wait for a black stone. She waited for the deepest point of the night, when the moon was hidden behind the peaks, and the guards were drowsy at their posts. Armed with a small oil lamp she had secreted away, a piece of charcoal, and a scrap of papyrus, she made her way to the western retaining wall.
It was a massive structure, built of colossal, ancient stones that predated the classical temple by centuries. Finding the start of a path in the darkness seemed a fool's errand, but Damon's words had been precise, behind the wall. She followed its length away from the sanctuary proper, towards the wild, untamed slopes of the mountain. She found it where the manicured grounds gave way to tangled undergrowth. A handful of stones, arranged in a way that seemed too deliberate to be natural, marked the beginning of a faint track leading up into the darkness. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pushed aside thorny branches and followed the trail. It was steep and treacherous. After a 20-minute climb that left her breathless, the path ended abruptly at a rock face, a jumble of boulders and fallen earth that was clearly the site of an ancient rockslide, the collapsed cave. She raised her lamp. The light flickered over the dark stone. At first, she saw nothing but cracks and lichen.
Then her lamp found them. They were carved into a smoother, darker slab of basalt, sheltered from the worst of the weather by an overhang. Damon was right. They were not letters, not pictograms of men or animals. They were shapes, a series of complex, interlocking geometric figures that seemed to shift and writhe in the unsteady light. There were 7 of them, arranged in a precise line. They were elegant, alien, and deeply unsettling. One of them, the third in the sequence, was a near-perfect representation of the crystalline name she had perceived in the Aditon. A shiver, born of terror and awe, traced its way down her spine. This was it. This was the lock. Her hands shook as she set down the lamp and unrolled her scrap of papyrus against the rock face. The charcoal felt clumsy in her fingers, a blunt, primitive tool for capturing such impossible precision. She worked with desperate focus, her breath misting in the cold night air. She copied each shape, noting the exact angles, the points where lines intersected or passed over one another without touching. It felt like transcribing a piece of music from a language she couldn't speak, a melody of pure mathematics. When she finished, her fingers were black with charcoal and numb with cold. She held the lamp close to the carvings one last time, trying to burn them into her memory. They were more than just symbols on a rock. They pulsed with a latent power, a warding that felt ancient and thin, like a threadbare blanket over a sleeping lion. Her gaze fell to the base of the rock slide. A thick tangle of ivy and hardy mountain shrubs grew amongst the boulders. Driven by an instinct she didn't understand, she began to pull at the vines, ignoring the scratches on her arms. Behind the curtain of leaves, she found it. A crack, a fissure no wider than her hand, leading back into the absolute blackness of the mountain's interior. She hesitated for only a heartbeat before leaning down and placing her cheek against the cold stone. A thin, cold breath, utterly devoid of moisture or the scent of earth, flowed from the crack. It was the same soul-numbing emptiness she had felt rising from the floor of the Aditon. The thrumming was stronger here. A silent bass note played on the bones of the world. It vibrated through the rock, through her jaw, a deep and patient hum of consciousness waiting. This was not merely the location of the forge. It was an entrance, a ventilation shaft for a prison of unimaginable scale. A loose stone dislodged from high up the slope, clattering down in the darkness. The sound was like a thunderclap in the profound silence. Panic flared in Elara's chest. She had been here too long. She grabbed her lamp and her precious drawing, scrambling back down the treacherous path, her mind a whirlwind. She moved through the shadows of the sanctuary like a ghost. As she neared the acolyte's dormitory, she heard the crunch of sandals on gravel. 2 temple guards, their spears resting on their shoulders, were making their rounds. Elara flattened herself into the unlit space between 2 columns, her heart pounding against her ribs so hard she was sure they could hear it. They passed by, their conversation a low murmur about a game of dice. The mundane sound was jarringly alien to the cosmic secret she was carrying. Safely back in her cot, the other girls breathing softly around her, she did not sleep. She lay on her back, staring into the darkness, the scrap of papyrus tucked securely in the folds of her peplos. The pieces were beginning to connect, forming a picture more terrifying than anything she could have imagined. Lycomedes was looking for a key, believing the prophecy was a weapon to be aimed. Damon was searching for a truth, a conspiracy to be exposed. Both of them were wrong. The prophecy was not a weapon, it was a release mechanism, and she, a nameless orphan, was the only person who possessed both the text and the schematics. She waited until the first hint of gray dawn softened the edges of the window slit, then carefully unrolled the papyrus. In the faint light, the charcoal shape seemed stark and menacing. She recited the first line of the prophecy from memory, her lips barely moving. "The chains of Tartarus shall sing a song of release." A song? A sequence of notes? She looked at the 7 symbols she had copied. They were arranged in a line, like notes on a scale. What if the prophecy wasn't just words? What if it was a cipher?
What if the Song of Release was a literal instruction, telling her the order in which to activate or deactivate these symbols? Her mind ignited. She pulled out another scrap of papyrus and a fresh piece of charcoal. She began to write, her hand flying. She cross-referenced every phrase in the prophecy with the forbidden text she had read. "The slumbering ones shall wake." Not one, but ones, plural. Was the sleeper the only prisoner or just the most powerful? When the sun bleeds upon the twice-cleft peak, an astronomical alignment, a specific time. And the moon tastes of salt and sorrow. A tide, a specific lunar phase over the Corinthian Gulf. A child born of neither god nor Titan shall break the seal of silence. Lycomedes thought it was her, but the forge log had said the chain bound a name, and the seal was one of silence. To break the seal was to speak the name, and she was the only one who had perceived that name. The pieces were no longer just connecting, they were fusing together. The prophecy was the combination, the carved symbols were the tumblers of the lock, and the astronomical events were the precise moment the key could be turned. A cold dread settled over her, heavier than any fear she had felt before. This was not a secret she could control or use as leverage. It was a loaded crossbow aimed at the heart of existence, and her finger was on the trigger. To reveal it to Lycomedes would be to give a child a torch in a warehouse of oil. To keep it to herself was to carry the weight of the world's continuation on her own. Damon's parting words came back to her, a knife that has not yet decided which way to cut. He was right. She could use this knowledge to destroy the sleeper's prison, or she could use it to reinforce it, to ensure the lock never turned. For the first time, a third path appeared in her mind, a path that led not to survival or service, but to power. What if she could learn not just how to open the prison, but how to control what was inside? The thought was blasphemous, insane, and it bloomed in the terrified core of her being with an undeniable allure. Lycomedes had called her nothing. The world had made her invisible, but the universe itself had just handed her the means to become the most significant no one in history. The morning bells rang, calling the acolytes to their duties. Elara carefully folded the papyrus, her sketch of the symbols a dark secret against her skin. As she rose from her cot to face the day, the other girls saw only a quiet, favored servant.
They did not see the woman who had stood at the precipice of the void and had just begun to contemplate pushing back.
The departure of the Spartans left a vacuum in the sanctuary, a sudden absence of abrasive energy that was more unnerving than their presence had been. The temple exhaled, the priests and priestesses resuming their placid routines, their chants no longer competing with the clang of bronze and the clipped Laconian dialect. For Elara, the quiet was a torment. It gave her too much space to think, to feel the silent, tectonic thrumming of the sleeper in the mountain's root, a presence that was now a constant, low-frequency hum at the edge of her awareness. Her research in the library became a frantic two-front war. For Lycomedes, she produced a steady stream of plausible but ultimately useless analyses of Titanomachy hymns and obscure commentaries on the Pythia's ravings. For herself, she hunted for the second half of the equation. The prophecy was the key to unlocking the prison. She needed to find the key to locking it again, or better yet, to controlling what was inside. She fixated on the forge log's description of the chain. Celestial ore, star metal, quenched not in water but in the silence between breaths. She scoured geological texts, mineralogical surveys, and alchemical treatises. She found references to siderous aranios, iron that fell from the sky, but the descriptions treated it as a mere curiosity, a metal that was difficult to forge and prone to rust. Nothing hinted at the conceptual, mind-binding properties the forge log described. The knowledge she needed was not just forbidden, it seemed to be non-existent, erased with the same thoroughness as the forge itself. It was during this frustrating search that her new reality asserted itself. She was hunched over a scroll detailing mining operations in Lorient when a shadow fell over the text. She looked up, expecting the impassive face of a temple guard, but instead found herself looking into a pair of eyes as ancient and wrinkled as the papyrus in her hands. Hecuba, the High Priestess of Hera's altar, stood before her. She was a woman carved from olive wood, small, gnarled, and impossibly tough. While Lycomedes commanded through fear and intellect, Hecuba commanded through sheer, unshakable piety. She had served the temple for 60 years, and it was said she could trace the bloodlines of every priestess back 5 generations. "The library is a place of stillness, child," Hecuba said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "But your spirit is a whirlwind. It disturbs the quiet." Elara quickly stood, bowing her head. "Forgive me, High Priestess, I was engrossed in my work." "The High Priest's work," Hecuba corrected her, her eyes drifting over the scrolls on Elara's table. Her gaze was sharp, missing nothing. "He has taken a special interest in you. This is a rare thing. Lycomedes is a man who values texts more than people. He sees them as more reliable." "I am honored by his trust," Elara murmured, the lie feeling thin and brittle under the old woman's scrutiny. "Honor is a heavy cloak, and his trust is a cage," Hecuba said. "For a generation, he has sought a key. He believes a great secret will grant him control over the temple's destiny, over the whims of the gods themselves. He is a fool. This place is not a lock to be opened. It is a balance to be maintained. Some doors are kept shut for a reason." She reached out a bony hand and touched the edge of a scroll Elara had been studying. "Be wary of the knowledge that promises power, child. True wisdom lies in knowing what to leave undisturbed." She gave a final penetrating look, then turned and walked away, her quiet footsteps a soft reproach on the stone floor. Elara sank back onto her stool, her carefully constructed composure crumbling. Hecuba had seen straight through her. She didn't know the specifics of the prophecy, but she knew the shape of Lycomedes' ambition, and she saw Elara as its instrument. Another player had stepped onto the board, one who fought not with threats and secrets, but with the unyielding force of tradition.
That night, the Black Stone was waiting. Lycomedes had summoned her to the Protagonist, the grand, columned entrance hall of the temple, a place usually reserved for receiving official delegations. The chamber was empty, save for the two of them, their forms dwarfed by the towering marble columns. "High Priestess Hecuba paid you a visit today," he stated, his voice echoing in the vast space. He knew. Of course he knew.
He had eyes and ears everywhere. "She offered some spiritual guidance," Elara said carefully. "Hecuba believes the gods are fragile things that must be protected from the slightest breeze of inquiry," Lycomedes scoffed. "She would see us dust the same old relics until the end of time, while the world crumbles around us. She is a relic herself. Pay her no mind." He began to walk, forcing Elara to fall into step beside him. "Your work has been adequate, but you are still sifting through the dirt. It is time you looked at the stars." He led her from the main hall into a smaller, circular chamber she had never seen before. The ceiling was a dome of dark, polished marble, inlaid with a breathtakingly intricate map of the night sky, rendered in silver and mother-of-pearl. At the center of the room, on a pedestal, sat a complex device of interlocking bronze rings and gears, an orrery more advanced than any she had ever imagined. "The Antikythera orrery," Lycomedes said, gesturing to the device with a sweep of his hand. "A gift to the temple from a Rhodian astronomer who saw more of the god's design in mathematics than in sacrifice. It predicts the movements of the sun, the moon, and the 5 wandering stars with perfect accuracy for centuries in either direction." He moved to the device and began to turn a small crank. The bronze rings whirred to life, celestial bodies of polished obsidian and ivory tracing their silent cosmic dance. "The prophecy speaks of a time when the sun bleeds upon the twice-cleft peak, and the moon tastes of salt and sorrow. This is not poetry, Elara. It is a set of celestial coordinates." He stopped turning the crank, his finger tapping one of the rings. "The twice-cleft peak is Parnassus, as viewed from the Ataton. A bleeding sun describes a total solar eclipse. The moon of salt and sorrow is a perigean springtide, when a new moon is closest to the earth, creating the highest possible tides in the Corinthian Gulf. These are not common occurrences. For them to happen on the same day is an event of staggering rarity." He looked at her, his eyes gleaming with a feverish intensity in the dim light. "I have spent 20 years calculating it. My predecessor spent 30 years before me. According to this device, the next such alignment, the only one for the next 400 years, will occur in 3 months' time, on the final day of the Festival of the Theophania." 3 months! The words landed like hammer blows. The abstract, mythical timeline of the prophecy had suddenly become terrifyingly real and immediate. "We have 3 months to find the location of the seal," Lycomedes continued, his voice low and urgent. "Hecuba is right about one thing. There are doors that are meant to remain shut. This prophecy is the key to one of them, but she believes it is a door that protects us. I believe it is a door that cages us." He fixed her with a look of startling candor. "Do you know why the gods are so capricious, Elara? Why they demand our blood and our fear? Because they themselves are afraid. They live in the shadow of their own creation myth, terrified that the Titans will return, that some new power will rise to supplant them, just as they supplanted their own father. They rule from a position of profound insecurity. This prophecy, it speaks of a power that predates the Titans, a power that could sweep the board clean. Imagine a world with no petty, jealous gods. Imagine a world guided not by fear, but by a singular, orderly, and absolute principle."
He was not just trying to prevent a catastrophe. He was trying to instigate a coup, to replace the chaotic pantheon of Olympus with the cold, mathematical certainty of the sleeper. He saw himself as a visionary, a liberator. Elara saw a man about to set fire to the world because he disliked the tapestry. "I need you to focus your search," Lycomedes commanded, his voice pulling her back from the dizzying precipice of his ambition. "Forget the hymns. Look at the temple's own history, records of construction, of repairs, of every stone that was ever moved. The seal is here, within the sanctuary. It must be. The forge log you discovered proves it. Find me any mention of a sealed chamber, a blocked passage, a room that exists on one plan but not another. Find me a whisper of celestial ore or star metal in an inventory list. The answer is in the details, the mundane minutiae that everyone else has overlooked."
He paused, then reached into the folds of his robe and produced a small, flat piece of dark, pitted stone. He pressed it into her hand. It was cold and unnaturally heavy. On its surface was a single carved symbol. It was the 5th symbol from the cave wall. Elara's blood ran to ice. She forced herself to keep her expression neutral, a mask of scholarly curiosity. "My predecessor found this in a hidden compartment within the Pythias chambers," Lycomedes explained. "He believed it to be a key of some kind, a warding symbol. I believe it is a fragment of the seal itself, or a map to it. Study it. See if anything in the library's archives matches its design. This is your only priority now. The clock is ticking." He left her there, alone with the whirring bronze heavens and the cold, hard proof of his proximity to the truth. She stared at the symbol in her hand, her mind reeling. He had a piece of the puzzle. He didn't know he only had one of 7, but he was on the path. The heavy shard of star metal in her palm was a point of absolute cold. It was not the chill of the marble chamber, but a profound coldness that seemed to drink the warmth from her very blood, a sliver of the void given form. A faint, almost sub-audible vibration pulsed from it, a silent harmony to the deeper thrumming that now permanently resonated in her bones. Lycomedes thought he had given her a clue. He had given her an anchor, a physical link to the entity in the mountain, and it terrified her. The next few weeks became a blur of controlled panic. She lived a double life in the library's dusty silence. For Lycomedes, she produced meticulous, annotated lists of every mention of sealed rooms or unusual construction in the temple's official archives, all of them frustratingly mundane: a wine cellar walled off after a collapse, a treasury vault decommissioned for structural reasons. She presented her failures to him with the perfect blend of diligence and disappointment, a performance that seemed to satisfy his conviction that the secret was well kept. For herself, she chased the ghost of the star metal. She started with the inventory logs, endless rolls of papyrus detailing every amphora of oil, every sack of barley, every block of marble that had entered the sanctuary for the past 5 centuries. The work was agonizingly tedious, a penance of boredom paid for a sliver of truth. Most nights, she fell into her cot with her eyes burning, the ghost script of supply manifests swimming behind her eyelids. She found it not in a grand treasury record, but in a dry, cracked scroll from the tenure of a notoriously fastidious quartermaster priest, a man who had recorded the weight of dust swept from the floors. Tucked within a list of materials for the 3rd temple reconstruction project, dated over 3 centuries ago, was an entry that made her stop breathing. 7 chthonian ingots, delivered under the seal of the protector, sourced from the Parnassus craterfall, not for assay, for immediate transfer to the sub-foundation architect. Chthonian, of the earth, a deliberate misnomer. Parnassus craterfall, a meteor strike. It was the star metal. 7 ingots, the perfect number. The clue wasn't hidden. It was merely mislabeled, buried in the open under a mountain of banality. The entry was cross-referenced to a series of architectural plans, scrolls she had already reviewed but had dismissed. She now pulled them again, her hands trembling. The plans for the sub-foundation were a labyrinth of support columns and drainage culverts beneath the main temple structure. But in one of the earliest drafts, there was a section that had been struck through with red ink. It showed a small, circular chamber set directly into the bedrock, far deeper than the rest of the foundation. Later plans showed this area as solid, filled in rock. The chamber had been erased from the design. On the original draft, beside the crossed-out chamber, was a single annotation in a cramped, scholarly hand. Peristyleon guess, access to be sealed upon completion of the rite. The courtyard of Gaia. The original temple at Delphi had not belonged to Apollo. It had belonged to Gaia, the primordial earth goddess. Apollo had seized it, slaying her guardian son Python at the foot of the mountain. The priests presented this as a triumph of order over chaos, but the plans suggested something else. Not a conquest, but a cover-up. Apollo hadn't just built his temple over Gaia's, he had incorporated its deepest chamber into his own foundation, and then sealed it from the world. This was the lock, not a door, but an entire buried chamber, the heart of the mountain. But the official archives yielded nothing more. The trail went cold, the plans for the final construction showing only solid rock. The knowledge of how to access it, the nature of the rite mentioned, was not in the High Priest's library. It belonged to an older tradition. It belonged to Hecuba. Approaching the High Priestess was a risk that made her encounter with Damon feel like a childish game. Hecuba was the living memory of the temple, her piety a shield against Lycomedes' radicalism. To question her was to question the bedrock of the sanctuary itself. Elara found her not at the grand altar of Hera, but in the temple's garden, a small walled sanctuary of cypress trees and wild mountain herbs.
The old woman was on her knees, her gnarled fingers carefully tending a patch of aconite, the queen of poisons. "High Priestess," Elara began, her voice softer than she intended. Hecuba did not look up. "The High Priest sends his little bird to peck at me now." "I came on my own," Elara said, taking a step closer. He has tasked me with a sacred duty, to understand the temple's deepest protections. He believes a time of peril is coming." She was using his paranoia as her shield. Hecuba paused, snipping a dark purple flower with her thumbnail. "There is always peril. It is the nature of the world. Men like Lycomedes think peril is a beast to be slain. I know it to be a tide to be endured." Elara took the shard of star metal from a pouch at her belt. She held it out on her open palm. "He gave me this. He called it a key, a warding symbol. But it feels wrong. It feels empty. It hums with a silence that frightens me." This was the heart of her gamble. She was using the truth of her fear to sell a lie of intent. Hecuba finally looked up, her gaze falling on the symbol. Her wrinkled face, usually a mask of stern piety, tightened with a flicker of something Elara could not read. It was not surprise. It was recognition and dread. "He is a grave robber who mistakes a tomb for a treasure chest," the old woman whispered, her eyes fixed on the shard. She rose slowly to her feet, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her dark peplos. "That is not a key, child. It is a link from a chain you should pray never breaks." "I do pray," Elara said, her voice catching with calculated desperation. "But my prayers feel hollow without knowledge. You spoke of balance, of doors that must remain shut. How can I help maintain that balance if I don't know what it is I am protecting?" For a long moment, Hecuba simply studied her, her ancient eyes searching for the taint of Lycomedes' ambition. Elara met her gaze, projecting an image of a frightened, pious girl caught in a game too large for her. Finally, Hecuba gave a slow, reluctant nod. There are records kept separate from the men's library. They are not scrolls of history, but of memory. The traditions of the Pythias, passed from high priestess to high priestess. They are called the anagraphi. They are not for the eyes of acolytes. But you are no longer a mere acolyte, are you? She led Elara not to a library, but to her own small, austere cell behind the altar. From a cedar chest that smelled of camphor and thyme, she removed a single, heavy scroll case of polished black wood. What you read here does not leave this room. It does not enter your reports to the high priest. It does not become a whisper in the dormitory. It becomes a burden on your soul. That is the price of this knowledge. Elara unsealed the case. The scroll within was not papyrus, but thin, supple sheets of vellum stitched together with gut. The script was a meticulous, archaic hand, passed down through generations. It was the secret history of Delphi. It spoke of the sleeper, though not by that name. It called the entity Ho Aphormos, the formless one. It described how Gaia had not imprisoned it, but had soothed it, using the harmonic resonances of the mountain to keep it in a state of dreamless slumber. The 7 symbols were not a lock, but a lullaby written in the language of creation. The rite was not a sealing, but an act of tuning, of reinforcing the harmonic cage. Apollo, in his arrogance, had not understood. He saw a prison and sought to strengthen its bars. He had the star metal chain forged, anchoring the name. But in doing so, he had introduced a discordant note. He had turned a sleeping entity into a prisoner, and prisoners dream of escape. The scroll contained a detailed description of the chamber, the peristelion gaze. It was reached through the service tunnels beneath the temple, via a passage hidden behind a false wall in the main cistern. And it described the ritual, the rite of stillness. The 7 stones were to be placed on a series of concentric circles carved into the floor of the chamber, their vibrations, amplified by the chamber's acoustics, reinforcing the sleeper's slumber. But then came the final, terrifying passage, written in a more recent, spidery script, Hecuba's own hand. The alignment approaches. The man who calls himself High Priest seeks to turn the rite of stillness into a rite of waking. He does not know that the prophecy of the unbinding is a trap. It is not the sleeper's cry for freedom. It is Apollo's final, desperate failsafe. If his Olympian order is threatened with destruction, the prophecy provides a means to unmake reality itself, a cosmic spite. He thinks he is opening a cage to release a weapon. He is opening a floodgate to drown the world. Elara looked up from the scroll, her blood cold. Hecuba was watching her, her expression grim. "He must be stopped," the old woman said, her voice a low command. "He believes he is a revolutionary. He is a suicide who would take the whole of creation with him." "How?" Elara whispered, the single word feeling impossibly small. "The rite requires all 7 stones. He has only one," Hecuba said. "The others, their locations were known only to the previous high priestess. She died before she could pass the knowledge to me. But she left a clue, a catechism she made me memorize as a novice. I thought it was a simple prayer to Gaia. Now I see it for what it is, a map." Hecuba closed her eyes, her voice taking on a rhythmic, liturgical cadence. "The first rests where the world's breath is first drawn, cleansed by the mountain's tears. The second sleeps where victor's laurels fade, and sweat returns to dust. The third is hidden from the chorus's gaze, beneath the smiling and the weeping masks. The fourth keeps the silence of the first voice atop the stone that remembers Python's fall. The fifth lies amongst the gifts of kings,
a shadow cast by a maiden of stone. And the sixth is bound to the world's true center, warmed by the heart that does not beat. Hecuba's voice faded, leaving the words hanging in the small, herb-scented room like motes of dust in a sunbeam. It was a map, woven into the fabric of a prayer. Elara's mind, honed by years of parsing cryptic texts, seized upon the images. "The mountain's tears," she breathed, her mind racing. "The Castalian spring, where all who enter the sanctuary must purify themselves." "And the world's breath," Hecuba affirmed, her eyes sharp. "The pneuma. The spring is where the sacred vapor is said to first mingle with the water. The first stone is there." Elara looked at the old woman, her awe momentarily eclipsing her fear. Hecuba had held this key for decades, believing it a simple hymn. The others, where victor's laurels fade, the stadium, beneath the masks, the theater, the stone of the first voice must be the Sibyl rock. "You see with clear eyes," Hecuba said, a flicker of approval in her expression. "The fifth, amongst the gifts of kings, must be in one of the treasuries. The Maiden of Stone likely refers to the caryatids of the Siphnian treasury. And the sixth, the world's true center? The Omphalos," Elara finished, "the stone in the Adaton that marked the navel of the world. One of the stones was hidden in the very chamber Lycomedes sought to defile. The irony was as sharp and cold as a shard of ice." 6 stones, 6 locations scattered across the sanctuary, and they had to retrieve them all before Lycomedes realized his single fragment was part of a larger whole. "He watches you," Hecuba stated, her voice pulling Elara back to the immediate danger. "He will note any deviation in your routine. You cannot simply go digging at the spring." "Then I need a reason to be there," Elara said, the gears of her mind turning. "A reason sanctioned by someone whose authority he might disdain but would not dare to openly challenge." She looked directly at Hecuba. A slow, grim smile touched the High Priestess's lips. "The right of the first draft is an ancient one, sacred to Hera. It requires an acolyte of pure heart to draw water from the Castalian spring in the hour before dawn, before its surface has been touched by the sun's light. It is a tradition Lycomedes has long dismissed as rustic superstition. He will not question it." The plan was simple, elegant, and terrifyingly risky. The following morning, well before the first bells, Elara slipped from the dormitory. She carried a ceremonial clay amphora, her official reason for being awake. Her unofficial tools were a small iron pry-bar, stolen from a stonemason's work pile, and the pounding of her own heart. The air was cold and thin, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. The sanctuary was asleep, a city of marble ghosts under a canopy of indifferent stars. The path down to the Castalian spring was carved into the cliff face, the stone worn smooth by the feet of countless pilgrims. As she descended, the sound of running water grew from a whisper to a constant musical rush. The spring emerged from a fissure in the rock face, spilling into a series of basins where visitors performed their ablutions. But the catechism had been specific, where the world's breath is first drawn. Not the public basins, but the source itself. Above the main basin, in a grotto slick with moss and maidenhair ferns, was the narrow fissure from which the water poured. Elara set down her amphora and lit her small oil lamp. The flame cast dancing, monstrous shadows on the wet rock. The air in the grotto was heavy with the smell of ozone and stone, a fainter echo of the scent in the Ataton. This was the place. She ran her hands over the rock around the fissure, her fingers numb from the cold spray. The stone was slick, seamless. Doubt began to creep in. What if she was wrong? What if the catechism was just a poem after all?
Then her fingers found it, a slight indentation, a stone shaped with just enough artifice to distinguish it from the natural rock around it. It was perfectly fitted, sealed with a mixture of lime and rock dust. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She took out the pry bar. The screech of iron on stone was unnervingly loud in the pre-dawn quiet. She froze, listening, but heard only the water and the wind. She worked carefully, chipping away at the ancient mortar, the effort sending jarring vibrations up her arm. Finally, with a low groan, the stone shifted. She pulled it free. Behind it was a small, dark cavity, barely large enough for her to fit her arm into. Reaching inside, her fingers brushed against something smooth and cold. It was a box, heavy and dense, made of lead. It was sealed with wax, the emblem of Gaia, a coiled serpent, still visible on its surface. She broke the seal and lifted the lid. Nestled in a bed of what looked like dried, blackened moss was the second stone. It was another shard of the star metal, dark and non-reflective, carved with the second symbol from her drawing, a shape like a frozen thunderbolt. She picked it up. The cold was familiar, but this one carried a different resonance, a silent, static hum, like the air after a lightning strike. A pebble skittered down the path above her. Elara's blood turned to ice. She extinguished her lamp, plunging the grotto into absolute darkness, and flattened herself against the wet rock. She held her breath, listening. The footsteps were light, but deliberate, not the heavy tread of a temple guard. Someone was descending the path, their movements quiet and sure. She risked a glance around the edge of the grotto. A single figure, cloaked and hooded, was moving towards the spring. They carried no lamp, navigating the treacherous path with an unnerving familiarity. They stopped at the main basin, knelt, and cupped their hands, drinking directly from the sacred water. Then, the figure stood and looked directly towards the grotto, as if they could feel her presence in the dark. For a terrifying moment that stretched into an eternity, the hooded figure remained motionless. Elara was certain she had been seen, that a cry would go up, that her conspiracy with Hecuba would be exposed. Then, the figure turned and ascended the path as silently as they had come. Elara waited until the footsteps had completely faded, her body trembling with cold and adrenaline. Who was it? A priest on a secret pilgrimage? An acolyte as sleepless as herself? Or one of Lycomedes' spies making their rounds? There was no time to ponder it. She quickly replaced the empty lead box and fitted the stone back into its cavity, using mud and pebbles to conceal her work. It wouldn't fool a close inspection, but it would have to do. She filled her amphora, her hands shaking so much that water sloshed over the rim. She returned to Hecuba's cell as the eastern sky was beginning to pale from black to a deep indigo. The old woman was awake, sitting on her simple stool as if she hadn't slept at all. Elara presented the stone. Hecuba took it, her face grim. She held it beside the one Lycomedes had given Elara, which she had taken for safekeeping. On the rough wool of her blanket, the two symbols lay like characters in a forgotten, terrifying alphabet. 2 of 7. "You were seen," Hecuba stated. It wasn't a question. "I don't know," Elara whispered. "A cloaked figure. They came to drink from the spring. They looked in my direction, but they left." "There are more than 2 players in this game," Hecuba said, her voice low. "The sanctuary has its own secrets, its own factions. Not all who distrust Lycomedes are my allies." She carefully wrapped the 2 stones in a piece of oiled leather and concealed them in a loose stone beneath her cot. The hiding place was so simple, it was brilliant. The stadium is next. It will be more difficult. The grounds are open, patrolled day and night. Where victor's laurels fade and sweat returns to dust, Elara recited, her mind already working. It speaks of the end of the race, the finish line. Or the crypts beneath the seats, where the bodies of athletes who died in the games were once interred. The catechism is a poem, child. It has layers. You must be certain before you act. Elara nodded, the weight of their tasks settling upon her. She was no longer just a librarian or a spy.
She was a hunter of relics, a reclaimer of secrets. As she left Hecuba's cell to begin the day's duties, she felt the familiar weight of Lycomedes' gaze as he passed her on the colonnade. He gave her a slight, questioning nod, and she inclined her head in dutiful submission, her face a mask of placid obedience. But inside, her heart was beating with a new, dangerous rhythm. It was the rhythm of the hunt, and she knew, with a terrifying certainty, that she was no longer the prey. Her new duty, sanctioned by Hecuba, was a fiction of exquisite mundanity. She was tasked with preparing the athletes' tunnels beneath the stadium for a long-neglected purification rite. It was the perfect cover, a menial, dusty job that took her to the exact location she needed to investigate, cloaked in the unimpeachable authority of tradition. Lycomedes would see it as proof of Hecuba's irrelevance, and therefore beneath his notice. Or so she had hoped. He cornered her 2 days later, not in the shadows, but in the blinding afternoon sun of the main colonnade. He seemed to materialize from the heat haze, his presence a sudden drop in temperature. "The High Priestess has you sweeping dust bunnies," he said, his voice devoid of inflection. "A curious use for my most promising researcher." Elara kept her eyes downcast, focusing on the intricate mosaic pattern at her feet. She believes the spirits of the fallen competitors grow restless. She says their lingering ambitions can curdle the air of the sanctuary. The ritual is meant to soothe them. She infused her voice with a hint of weariness, the tone of a scholar forced to indulge a superior's foolish whim. Lycomedes was silent for a moment. She could feel his gaze on her, analytical and cold. "And you, Elara, what do you believe?" "I believe," she said, choosing her words with the care of someone disarming a trap, "that a restless spirit and a draft from a poorly sealed tunnel can feel much the same to an old woman. But her faith is a pillar of this sanctuary. It is not my place to shake it." A slow smile touched his lips, thin and sharp. He had bought it. He saw her as a pragmatist, an intellectual ally forced to play along with the senile piety of his rival. He had placed her in a box of his own making. "Indeed," he said, the smile vanishing. "Indulge her, sweep your dust, but do not forget what you are truly looking for. Time is a current, and we are being swept towards the waterfall. Do not get distracted by the eddies along the shore." He moved on, leaving her with a racing heart and the sour taste of another successful lie. He was not just watching her, he was testing her, probing the edges of her loyalty, ensuring she remained his tool. Every word she spoke was a step on a tightrope over a chasm. That night, she moved. The keys Hecuba had given her were ancient, the iron pitted and heavy. They grated in the lock of the service gate to the stadium, the sound obscenely loud in the moonless dark. She slipped inside, pulling the heavy door shut behind her. The air in the tunnel was thick and still, smelling of cold earth, damp stone, and something else, a faint, ghostly echo of sweat and olive oil, as if the exertions of 1,000 athletes had been permanently absorbed by the walls. Her lamp cast a small, trembling circle of light. She ignored the main passage and followed a narrower, descending tunnel that Hecuba's instructions had described.
This was the entrance to the old crypts, the final resting place for competitors who had died in the pursuit of glory. The air grew colder, the silence more profound. The crypts were a series of small, unadorned niches carved into the rock, most sealed with simple stone plugs. Here and there, a wealthier family had afforded a small plaque. She ran her light over the names: Mylon of Craton, dead from a chariot crash; Philippos the Theban, his heart bursting at the finish line. Each name was a story of ambition ending in dust. She scanned the crypts for any sign of a hidden compartment, a loose stone, a symbol carved into a wall. Nothing. Hecuba's theory seemed to be a dead end. She moved deeper, towards the oldest section, where the stone was rougher, the carving more primitive. It was here she found it. It was not a crypt, but a memorial. A shallow alcove held a single life-sized carving of a strigil, the curved bronze tool used to scrape oil and dirt from the body. It was a memorial to a runner named Theron of Hargos, who, according to the faded inscription, had surrendered his final breath to the dust from which he came. Sweat returns to dust. This was it. The bronze strigil was set into a marble base. It looked solid, a single piece of cast metal. She ran her hands over it, feeling for a seam, a switch, a hidden catch. Nothing. It was cold, solid, and immovable. Desperation began to prickle at her. Had she come all this way for nothing? She thought back to the catechism, reciting the line in her mind. "Where victors' laurels fade, and sweat returns to dust." The strigil was for the sweat, but what of the laurels? Her eyes scanned the alcove again. At the top of the arch, almost lost in the shadows, was a faded carving of a laurel wreath. She reached up, her fingers tracing the carved leaves. One of them felt different. It moved under her touch. She pressed it. With a low, grinding sound of stone on stone, a section of the marble base beneath the strigil receded, revealing a dark, hollow space. Her heart leaped. Inside, resting on a bed of what looked like linen turned to dust, was the third stone. It was carved with the symbol of a spiral, coiling into an infinitely dense center. As she reached for it, she felt its unique vibration. Not the static hum of the second stone, but a low, pulling thrum, a gravitational resonance that seemed to tug at the very space around it. She wrapped it in a piece of cloth and secured it in her pouch, her fingers trembling with relief and triumph. Then she heard it, a soft scuff of a sandal on the stone floor of the main passage, far down the tunnel. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. A guard. She hadn't heard them approach. She quickly pushed the stone panel back into place, the grinding noise echoing in the claustrophobic space. She extinguished her lamp and pressed herself into the shadows of the alcove, her body rigid. The footsteps grew closer, slow and measured. But they were wrong. They were too light for a guard's heavy, hobnailed sandals. They were stealthy. It was the same light, deliberate tread she had heard at the spring. The footsteps stopped just outside the entrance to the crypts. Elara held her breath, her ears straining. She could hear nothing, no breathing, no rustle of cloth. Just the oppressive, listening silence. It was the cloaked figure. They knew she was here. They had followed her. Her mind raced. Were they an agent of Lycomedes sent to test her? An ally of Hecuba's sent to protect her? Or something else entirely, a third player moving their own pieces across the board? Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from a different tunnel, back towards the stadium entrance. It sounded like a stack of terracotta amphorae being kicked over, a cascade of shattering clay. Shouted voices followed almost immediately. The guards. They had been much closer than she thought. Their heavy footsteps now pounded away from her location, towards the source of the noise. A diversion. It had been deliberate. The cloaked figure had saved her. After a few moments of silence, the light footsteps receded, heading back the way they came, their purpose served. They had not revealed themselves, they had not confronted her, they had simply cleared her path. Elara waited until the last echoes faded, her body shaking uncontrollably. She was not just being watched, she was being managed, manipulated by a force whose motives were utterly opaque. This secret war for the soul of Delphi was being fought in more corners than she knew. She fled the stadium tunnels, her prize feeling less like a victory and more like a piece of bait she had successfully snatched from a closing trap. Back in Hecuba's cell, she placed the third stone with the other two. 3 down, 4 to go. They lay on the dark cloth, a small constellation of silent power. "They helped me," Elara recounted, her voice barely a whisper, describing the diversion. "They knew the guards were there. They saved me." Hecuba's face was a mask of deep, troubled thought. She stared at the 3 stones as if they were sleeping vipers. "There was another order," she said, slowly, her voice a dry rustle. "Before the Olympians, before the schism between the priests of Apollo and the priestesses of Hera. They were called the Koinon, the earth shared. They were not priests or acolytes, but custodians. They believed that both Gaia's slumber and Apollo's chains were flawed solutions. They sought a third way, a permanent severance, to cut the prison away from the world entirely, but at the cost of Delphi itself. They saw the sanctuary not as a holy site, but a necessary sacrifice, a cancerous growth to be cut away to save the body." Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the pre-dawn air.
A third faction, with an agenda more radical and terrifying than even Lycomedes. They didn't want to release the sleeper or keep it sleeping. They wanted to annihilate it, and Delphi along with it. Do they still exist? "I thought them a legend, a story to frighten novices," Hecuba admitted. "But if someone is shadowing you, helping you gather the stones, they may want you to do the work for them, to bring all the pieces together in one place, ready for their own final rite." Elara looked down at her hands. They were stained with grime from the crypt and bronze dust from the memorial. She was not a reclaimer. She was a pack animal, carrying pieces of a world-ending weapon for 3 different masters, each with their own vision of the apocalypse. "The theater is next," Hecuba said, her voice grim, pulling Elara from her spiraling thoughts. Hidden from the chorus's gaze, beneath the smiling and the weeping masks, it will be the most public location yet. The theater was a wound in the mountainside, a great stone amphitheater that faced the valley of olive groves. In the daylight, it was a place of stark, beautiful geometry, but Elara now saw it as a tactical nightmare. There were 1,000 places to watch from, no shadows to hide in, and its work was done in the full light of day. Hecuba's plan was, once again, a masterstroke of misdirection. A minor festival, the Linnea, was a month away. While not a grand event at Delphi, it required the usual chorus and actors. Hecuba, citing a series of ill omens, decreed that the sacred masks of Dionysus, the very embodiment of comedy and tragedy, must be reconsecrated. The delicate work of cleaning and repainting the ancient linen and plaster artifacts was assigned to Elara, whose steady hand had been noted by the temple scribes. It gave her unfettered access to the skene, the stage building where the props and costumes were stored. The chamber was a small, windowless room behind the stage, smelling of old wood, linseed oil, and the faint, sweet scent of decay. Dozens of masks hung from pegs on the walls or were laid carefully on shelves. Their painted expressions were frozen in silent emotion, the gaping mouths of tragic kings, the leering grins of satyrs, the serene faces of nymphs. Elara had expected to be alone. She was not. An old man with a face as wrinkled and expressive as one of his own masks sat on a low stool, meticulously stitching a rip in a chorus member's robe. He looked up as she entered, his eyes a watery, cynical blue. "Another one," he grumbled, his voice like gravel stirred with a stick. "The High Priestess gets a twitch in her gut, and suddenly my workshop is as busy as the Agora. I am Philemon. I am the keeper of these faces. Try not to break anything." He was the theater's custodian, a fixture as permanent and overlooked as the worn flagstones. He was an unforeseen complication, a warden in her prison. "The High Priestess has charged me with preparing the masks for the Linnea," Elara said, her voice calm and respectful. "Preparing them," he scoffed, biting off a thread with his teeth. "She means daubing them with smelly oils and chanting nonsense until she feels better about the goat entrails she had for breakfast. These are not holy relics, girl. They are tools. Linen, plaster, and paint. They have more to fear from mildew than from divine displeasure." For 2 days, Elara worked under his constant, grumpy supervision. She cleaned the masks with a soft cloth, her movements slow and deliberate, while her eyes mapped every inch of the room. She checked beneath the shelves, tapped the walls, examined the heavy chests where the most valuable masks were stored. Nothing. Philemon watched her, his cynicism a constant, unnerving presence. He would tell her stories of arrogant actors and failed plays, his words painting a picture of a world governed not by gods, but by human vanity and incompetence. "The chorus stands in the orchestra, the circle of dirt down there," he said on the 3rd day, gesturing vaguely towards the stage. "They look up at the actors on the proskenyon. They don't see what's back here. This is the house of lies, the place where we build the truths they go out there to perform." Hidden from the chorus's gaze. He had just confirmed it. The stone had to be in this room. Her attention kept returning to the 2 largest chests, one carved with a smiling mask, the other with a weeping one. They were made of heavy, dark cedar and sat side by side against the back wall. She had examined them as best she could, but Philemon was always there, a hawk watching a field mouse. The catechism said, beneath the masks, the floor. She found her opportunity in her pride. "The mask of Oedipus," she said, holding up the tragic face, its eyes gouged out in painted agony. Philemon snatched it from her, offended. "It is not fading. It is resting. It requires a specific binder, ground from Laconian beetle shells, very rare. We have none." "I saw a jar of it in the scribe's workshop," Elara lied, her heart starting to beat faster. "A small one, reserved for illustrating the most sacred texts. The quartermaster, Theon, keeps it under lock and key." Philemon's eyes lit up with a covetous gleam. Theon was his professional rival. He does he? The miser, hoarding it for his silly little pictures while true art decays. He stood up, his joints cracking. "You have a good eye, girl. Keep working. Don't touch anything you don't understand. Which is everything." He shuffled out of the room, on a fool's errand she had invented. She had minutes at most. She flew to the chests. The floor beneath them was made of heavy, fitted flagstones. She ran her fingers along the seams, pressing down on each one. Nothing. She moved a chest of comedic masks first, grunting with the effort. The stone beneath was solid. Then she moved the tragic chest. And there it was, a single floor stone that shifted slightly under the chest's weight, rocking with a faint grinding sound. It was the wobbly stone Philemon had complained about last week, blaming it on the damp. She didn't have a pry bar. She used the handle of a heavy bronze stage hammer, forcing the tip into the crack. The stone was heavy. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she strained, her muscles screaming. With a final, desperate heave, the stone lifted. Beneath it was a hollow filled with dry sand, and in the sand, wrapped in oilcloth, was the 4th stone. This one bore the symbol of a perfect circle with a single straight line drawn through its center. She touched it, and the resonance that met her was utterly different from the others. It was a perfect, resonant silence, a void, the sound of a voice that had been cut off mid-syllable, the silence of the first voice. She heard footsteps approaching. Philemon was coming back. Panic flared. She couldn't get the heavy stone back in place in time. She did the only thing she could. She grabbed the stone, dropped the floor slab back into its hole with a heavy, muffled thud, and shoved the tragic chest back over it, scraping it across the floor. She was on her knees, pretending to scrub a spot on the wood when Philemon entered. He was grumbling, empty-handed. "Theon is a liar and a toad. He has no beetle shells. He laughed at me." He squinted at her. "What was that noise?" "The chest slipped when I was cleaning behind it," Elara said, her voice remarkably steady. She rose to her feet, hiding the wrapped stone in the folds of her peplos. "My apologies, Keeper." His eyes narrowed, darting from her face to the chest, then to the floor. For a heart-stopping moment, she was sure he knew. He saw the fresh scrape marks on the stone. But his pride, his own narrative of the world, saved her. "Careless," he muttered, but his mind was already back on his feud with the quartermaster. "It's this damp. Rots the floors, rots the masks, rots the bones. Nothing lasts." Elara made her excuses and left, her legs unsteady. She had the fourth stone. She was more than halfway there, but the risk had been immense, her escape a matter of pure luck. She could feel the net tightening. She took the long way back, through a less-traveled colonnade that bordered the sanctuary's western edge. She needed the time to calm her racing heart, to push the fear back into its box. She rounded a corner, her eyes on the ground, and almost walked straight into him. He stood with his back to a column, as if he had been waiting for her. He wore a simple traveler's tunic, no armor, no Spartan cloak. But there was no mistaking the breadth of his shoulders, the predatory stillness, or the winter sea eyes that were now fixed on her. It was Damon. Her blood ran cold. The Spartans were gone. He should not be here. "You look surprised to see me, little librarian," he said, his voice a low rumble that was not meant for anyone else to hear. "Lord Damon," she stammered, instinctively dropping into a subservient bow. I thought your king had returned to Sparta." "Aegis Salus returned to Sparta," he corrected her, pushing himself off the column. "He did not. My work here was unfinished." "Your work?" His eyes scanned her face, missing nothing. The flush of adrenaline, the dust on her tunic, the slight bulge in her peplos where the stone was hidden. "My work is watching people who lie," he said, "like girls who claim there is nothing behind the western wall and then spend their nights climbing it. Like high priests who consult oracles about war, but are truly interested in digging up graves." He knew. He must have had someone watching her, watching Lycomedes. His network was better than she could have possibly imagined. "I don't know what you mean," she whispered, the lie flimsy and useless. "Don't you?" he countered. He reached out, not to touch her, but to pluck a single dry leaf from her hair. "You are a terrible liar, Elara. That's what makes you so interesting. You have the courage for espionage, but not the constitution for deceit." He lowered his voice. "I am not your enemy. Not yet. Lycomedes is trying to unlock something he thinks will be a weapon for him to control. I know it is something else, something that, if released, will make Sparta's wars and Athens' ambitions look like children squabbling in the dirt. I think you know it too." He paused, his gaze intense. "I am here because Sparta does not like unstable neighbors, and this mountain is starting to feel very unstable. Whatever secret you and Lycomedes and that old crow Hecuba are fighting over, it is about to spill out into the world. I want to know what it is, and you are going to tell me." The colonnade was suddenly a cage, the marble columns its bars, and Damon the predator inside it with her. His presence was an oppressive weight, a physical force that seemed to suck the air from her lungs. He had stripped away her layers of deceit with a few casual sentences, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. But beneath the terror, a spark of defiance kindled. She was not the same girl who had trembled before Lycomedes. She had carried the silence of the void in her hand. A Spartan stare was a lesser fear. Sparta's interests are in armies and borders, she said, her voice a low, steady thing that surprised even her. This is a matter of faith, of sacrilege. It is a problem for the gods, not for your king. A flicker of something, not quite amusement, but perhaps respect, passed through his eyes. The gods have a habit of making their problems our problems. When a priest starts digging for a power that can sweep the board clean, as I heard one of your acolytes whisper, that is no longer a matter of faith. It is a matter of state security. My state. He had an informant, not just a spy watching the walls, but someone inside the acolyte circles. The thought was chilling. The web of intrigue was denser than she had ever imagined. "So you will stop him?" she challenged. "You will march into the Adaton and arrest the High Priest of Delphi? The world will see Sparta making war on Apollo himself. Your pious kings would never sanction it." She had him. She saw it in the slight tightening of his jaw. He was a shadow, an unofficial agent. He could watch, he could threaten, but he could not act openly without causing a catastrophic political incident. His power was limited to the darkness, and she had just dragged him into the light. "You are clever," he conceded, his voice losing some of its edge and gaining a dangerous smoothness. "Clever enough to know you are standing between two collapsing walls. Lycomedes will use you until you are no longer useful, and then he will erase you. That old priestess, Hecuba, she will sacrifice you to protect her traditions without a second thought. They see you as a key, a tool. I see you as a survivor, and survivors know how to make alliances." An alliance with Sparta? The words tasted like poison. "An alliance with me," he corrected. "I don't want the weapon. I want to ensure it is never used. Not by Lycomedes, not by Athens, not by anyone. You and the old woman are trying to gather the pieces to hide them. I can help you. I can provide distractions. I can give you information. My network is extensive. All I ask for in return is the truth. What is he trying to unleash, and what are these little trinkets you are collecting?" His gaze dropped pointedly to the bulge at her waist. This was the precipice. A lie would end this conversation, likely with violence. The full truth would give him a power she could not comprehend. She chose a third path, a truth he could understand, stripped of its cosmic terror and framed in the language of power he respected. "Lycomedes believes the temple is a prison," she said. "He believes a primordial entity is caged beneath us. Not a god, not a titan, something older. He thinks he can control it, use it to enforce his own vision of order on the world. And you are collecting the keys to this cage?" "No," she said, meeting his gaze. "We are collecting the fragments of the lock, to reinforce it, to keep the door shut forever." For a long moment, Damon was silent. He studied her, his expression unreadable. He was weighing her words, searching for the tells of a liar, and finding only the conviction of a terrified zealot. "Show me," he commanded. Her heart hammered. It was an unthinkable risk, but refusing would be an admission of duplicity. Slowly, she reached into her peplos and unwrapped the fourth stone. She held it out on her palm. The theater stone seemed to drink the sunlight, a circle of perfect nothingness bisected by a line of utter finality. Damon leaned closer, his eyes narrowed. He did not reach for it.
He was a soldier looking at a piece of unfamiliar ordnance, assessing its threat. "What is it made of?" he asked. "Star metal," she replied, "iron that does not belong to this world." He grunted, a sound of acknowledgement. He did not mock the idea. He accepted it as a piece of tactical data. "And there are more of these?" "7 in total. We have 4.
She had just given him a critical piece of intelligence, but it was a necessary sacrifice. He straightened up, his eyes leaving the stone and locking back onto hers. Lycomedes must not get them. If he is as close as my sources say, you are running out of time. Where is the next one? We are not certain. It was a small, necessary lie to hold something back. Find out, he ordered. You now have a partner, little librarian, whether you want one or not. Do not try to deceive me. I will know, and my methods for dealing with unreliable assets are far less pleasant than the High Priestess. He turned and walked away, melting back into the patterns of light and shadow along the colonnade, as if he had never been there. Elara stood frozen for a full minute, the cold weight of the stone in her hand, the even colder weight of her new reality settling upon her. She had survived. She had gained a powerful, terrifying, and utterly untrustworthy ally. When she finally reached Hecuba's cell, her composure was a thin, brittle shell. She placed the 4th stone with the others and recounted her encounter with the Spartan, leaving nothing out. The old woman's face grew dark as she listened. When Elara finished, Hecuba was silent for a long time, her gnarled fingers tracing the spiral symbol on the 3rd stone. You have invited the wolf to guard the sheepfold, she finally said, her voice heavy with disapproval. The wolf was already inside, Elara countered, her voice sharp with the remnants of adrenaline. And the shepherd is a madman who wants to slaughter the sheep himself. I have merely shown the wolf where the madman keeps his knife. Hecuba looked up, her ancient eyes holding a flicker of surprise at Elara's fire. You trust a Spartan, a man whose city was built on deceit and violence? He serves only Sparta. When it suits him, he will take the stones from your dead hands and deliver them to his kings. I don't trust him, Elara said, but I can use him. He thinks this is about a weapon, a terrestrial power struggle. He has no concept of what is truly at stake. As long as he believes we are on the same side, preventing Lycomedes gaining power, he will help us. He is a tool, Hecuba, just as we are tools to him. The High Priestess seemed to age before her eyes. The certainties of her world, of ritual and tradition, were crumbling, being replaced by a brutal new world of espionage and desperate alliances. The paths grow dark and tangled, she murmured. The catechism becomes a battlefield map. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her resolve hardening once more. The 5th stone lies amongst the gifts of kings, a shadow cast by a maiden of stone. The Cypnian treasury, Elara said immediately. It is the most opulent, filled with gold and ivory offerings, and its portico is supported not by columns, but by 2 caryatids, 2 maidens of stone. It is also one of the most secure buildings in the sanctuary, Hecuba noted. The bronze doors are barred from the outside at night, and a priest-treasurer sleeps within. During the day, it is never without a guard. A shadow cast, Elara mused, the puzzle of it pushing the fear of Damon away. That implies a specific time, a moment when the sun is in a certain position. We need to know the treasury's exact orientation. The next day, Elara feigned an errand that took her past the treasury. It was a jewel box of a building, its Parian marble gleaming, its friezes depicting the gigantomachy in vivid painted detail. The 2 caryatids stood serene and implacable, their sculpted robes flowing, their heads holding up the weight of the portico. She noted the position of the sun, the length of the shadows. She would have to return at different hours. Damon found her that evening as she was leaving the library. He didn't sneak up on her this time. He simply fell into step beside her as she walked down a deserted corridor. "The treasury of the Cypnians," he said, his voice low. "A likely target for a man looking for gifts of kings." He was probing, testing to see if she would lie. "It is," she confirmed, deciding that transparency was her best shield. "The catechism points there. The problem is access. It is never unguarded." "All guards have routines," Damon said dismissively, "moments of distraction. Tell me what you are looking for, specifically." "A shadow cast by one of the caryatids."
"We believe that at a certain time of day, the shadow will point to a hidden mechanism or a loose stone." He was quiet for a moment. "The afternoon guard change. The two sentries meet at the eastern corner of the treasury platform. For a full minute, their attention is on each other, not the building. This happens at the 9th hour of the day. What will the sun be doing then?" Elara's mind worked quickly, visualizing the sun's arc. At the 9th hour, late afternoon, the sun would be low in the west. The shadows of the two statues would be stretched long across the portico floor. "The shadow of the southern caryatid will fall directly upon the northern one's pedestal," she breathed. "Then that is your moment," Damon said. "I will create a secondary distraction, something to hold the guard's attention for a few extra moments after their exchange. Be ready. You will not get a second chance." The plan was set. 2 days later, as the sun began its descent towards the western mountains, Elara approached the treasury. She carried a wooden tablet coated in a thin layer of dark wax and a silver stylus, the perfect disguise for a studious acolyte. To any casual observer, she was simply one of the many scholars who documented the sanctuary's wonders, her task to render the intricate folds of the caryatid's marble gowns. Her fingers, however, were stiff with tension, and the stylus felt clumsy and foreign in her grasp. The air was warm, but a cold dread coiled in her stomach. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of eyes. Every distant laugh felt like a prelude to an alarm. She positioned herself on a bench across the sacred way, affording her a clear view. She etched meaningless lines onto the wax, her gaze flicking constantly between the sun's slow descent and the two guards flanking the treasury's entrance. They were veterans, their faces impassive, their bronze-tipped spears held with an easy, lethal familiarity. They were not men who would be easily fooled. The minutes stretched, each one a taut cord of anxiety. The shadows of the columns and treasuries elongated, painting the path in stripes of gold and deep violet. Pilgrims ambled past, their voices a low murmur, their faces filled with awe. They were living in a world of serene faith, oblivious to the abyss churning just beneath the sacred stone. Elara felt a pang of envy so sharp it was like a physical pain. Then the moment arrived. The sun dipped behind a shoulder of Mount Parnassus, and the light shifted, becoming softer, more direct. The shadow of the southern caryatid crept across the marble floor of the portico, a finger of darkness, reaching, touching, and finally enveloping the base of its northern sister. It was perfect. At that exact instant, as if cued by a divine playwright, the two replacement guards began their ascent up the treasury steps. The current sentries straightened, their ritual of exchange beginning. Further down the slope, near the Athenian treasury, chaos erupted. Two men, dressed as wealthy traders from Corinth, began to shout at each other. Their argument, initially a low growl, escalated with startling speed into a full-throated roar of accusation. "You swore on the life of your own son," one bellowed, his face purple with rage. "Your son is a goat herd with the wits of his flock. Your word is worth less than the dirt on my sandals," the other retorted. A leather pouch was thrown, striking the stones and bursting open. A shower of silver drachmas scattered across the path, gleaming in the dying light. The effect was instantaneous.
Every pilgrim, every priest, every loiterer within earshot turned. The guards at the Siphnian treasury, their exchange forgotten, took a collective step forward, their eyes drawn to the glint of coin and the promise of violence. It was a masterful piece of theater, playing on the basest human instincts of greed and curiosity. It was Damon's brutal, effective signature. This was her chance. Elara stood, her movements fluid and unhurried. She crossed the path, tablet in hand, as if intending to get a closer look at the pedestal's inscription, now conveniently cast in shadow. Her heart was a wild drum against her ribs. She was exposed, in the open, but the world's attention was focused elsewhere. She knelt beside the northern caryatid's base. In the cool, deep shadow, the marble's surface looked different. A hairline crack, utterly invisible in the direct sun, was now discernible. It formed a perfect square, no larger than her hand. There was no handle, no button. She pressed her fingers against it, tracing the seam. She remembered the catechism, a shadow cast. It wasn't just a pointer, it was the key. The mechanism was not mechanical, but elemental, a trick of light and perception. She pushed her thumb into the center of the square. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, with a faint, soundless whisper of perfectly balanced stone, the panel depressed and slid inward, revealing a cavity lined with what looked like black fleece. There it lay, the fifth stone. It was shaped like a lens, a polished disc of absolute black that seemed to swallow the ambient light. Carved into its surface was the symbol of two overlapping circles, a vesica piscis, the shape of a cosmic eye or a wound between worlds. She reached in, her fingers brushing the cold, unnaturally smooth surface. The resonance that met her was a profound dampening, a cone of silence that seemed to push back against the world. It felt like an ending, a negation. It did not hum with power. It hummed with the absence of it. She snatched it, her fingers closing around its chilling smoothness, and tucked it into a hidden pocket in her sleeve. As she pushed the stone panel closed, it clicked shut with a soft finality. The entire act had taken less than 10 seconds. She rose, turning to walk away, her soul screaming with the need to run, and froze. Standing not 5 paces away, his back to the commotion, was a young acolyte named Eosin. He was one of Lycomedes' favorites, a zealot with eyes that burned with borrowed ambition. He hadn't been watching the fight, he had been watching her. His mouth was slightly agape, his face a mask of disbelief, rapidly hardening into the righteous certainty of a spy who has just uncovered a great betrayal. He had seen it all, the shadow, the hidden panel, the removal of an object. The world seemed to fall silent. The shouting of the traitors became a distant buzz. The only sound was the frantic pounding of her own blood in her ears. Eosin's eyes met hers, and in them she saw her own death warrant. He opened his mouth to shout. "Wait," Elara hissed, the single word sharp and commanding. She took a step towards him, her mind a maelstrom of desperate calculation. His mouth closed, his brow furrowed in confusion at her audacity. "You saw nothing," she continued, her voice a low, intense whisper. "The High Priest himself tasked me with this. It is a test of loyalty for all his acolytes. He wanted to see who was truly watchful, who served the temple instead of their own idle curiosity. It was a preposterous lie, thin as smoke, but she delivered it with the unshakable conviction of a priestess delivering a prophecy. She was banking on his ingrained obedience, his desperate need to please their master." Eosin's eyes darted from her to the treasury, then back. Doubt warred with suspicion on his face. "A test? He said nothing to me." "Of course not," Elara scoffed, injecting a note of pity into her tone. "That is the point of a test, Eosin. He told me to retrieve this from its hiding place. It is a relic, a key to understanding the temple's true defenses. He is entrusting it only to those he can truly rely on. I was to see if any of the lesser acolytes were diligent enough to notice. You were. He will be pleased." She watched the lie take root in his mind, flowering into a new, more palatable narrative. He was not a witness to a crime. He was a successful student. His suspicion was not a threat to her, but proof of his own value. "He will be pleased," he repeated, the idea seductive. "Very," Elara affirmed, pressing her advantage, "but only if you demonstrate the final, most important quality he seeks, discretion. A secret is only powerful when it is kept. Report this to him, and he will know you are loyal. Shout it to the guards, and he will know you are a fool who cannot be trusted with true responsibility. The choice is yours." By now, Damon's men had been separated by the guards. The show was over. The crowd was dispersing. The window of privacy was closing. Iosin stared at her, his mind churning. He wanted to believe her. Believing her meant he was important, chosen. Disbelieving her meant a confrontation he was not prepared for. I will report to the High Priest," he said finally, his voice stiff with a newfound sense of purpose. "I will tell him of my vigilance." "Excellent," Elara said, her smile feeling like a mask of cracking clay. "I will see you there." She turned and walked away, not looking back, her legs trembling so violently she was certain she would collapse. Every instinct screamed at her that Iosin would betray her, that he would run straight to Lycomedes with a garbled story of theft and deception. She had not neutralized a threat. She had merely aimed it, turning it into a missile that would strike the High Priest's chambers. She had bought herself, at most, an hour. She had to get to Hecuba, and then she had to face Lycomedes and pray her lie was strong enough to survive his cold, analytical gaze. She did not run. To run was to confess. Instead, she walked, each step a measured act of will against the screaming panic that demanded she flee. The colonnade seemed to stretch into an impossible length, every shadow a potential hiding place for another pair of eyes. She could feel Iasin's gaze on her back, a physical pressure, before he would have turned and made for the High Priest's quarters near the great altar. She clutched the sleeve containing the fifth stone, the cold disk a point of focus in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. Hecuba's cell was as she had left it, a pocket of calm in the heart of the storm. The old woman looked up as Elara entered, and the placid expression on her face dissolved at the sight of Elara's pallor. "You have it," Hecuba stated, her eyes flicking to Elara's sleeve. "But something is wrong." "I was seen," Elara said, her voice tight and breathless. She pulled the lens-shaped stone from its hiding place and laid it on the small table. 5 dark fragments now lay on the rough-spun cloth, a gathering of silent, cosmic words. She quickly recounted the encounter, the lie she had spun for Iasin, the inevitable confrontation now waiting for her in Lycomedes' study. Hecuba listened without interruption, her face becoming a mask of grim concentration. "You have bought time with a line of credit you cannot repay," she said when Elara had finished. "He will ask to see the relic you retrieved." "I know," Elara whispered. "I have nothing to show him." "No," Hecuba said, a strange, fierce light in her eyes. "You have this." She rose stiffly and went to her cot. From the same hollowed-out stone that held the star metal fragments, she retrieved another object, wrapped in stained, yellowed linen. She placed it in Elara's hands. It was a piece of obsidian, polished by volcanic heat and countless hands into a smooth, egg-like shape. It was utterly black, but when held to the lamplight, faint, milky nebulae seemed to swirl in its depths. It was cold to the touch, heavy with a sense of age and dormant purpose. "The Moirai stone," Hecuba explained, her voice a low hush. "It was used by the Pythia centuries ago, before Apollo's influence became absolute. They would stare into it, and its patterns would guide their visions, helping them untangle the threads of fate. It is a tool of perception, nothing more, but it holds the gravity of its own history. Lycomedes will feel that." Elara's mind seized on the idea. "A focus," she breathed, "a key to interpreting the prophecy of the unbinding." "Precisely," Hecuba affirmed. "It appeals to his vanity. He does not seek merely to unleash a power. He seeks to understand and command it. Give him a tool he believes only he has the intellect to wield, and he will not question its origin too closely. She placed a withered hand on Elara's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. Now go. The longer you wait, the weaker your story becomes. And Elara, be the scholar he thinks you are. Drown him in details he cannot question. Armed with a new lie and a tangible prop, Elara walked towards the High Priest's chambers. The guards at the door, recognizing her, stepped aside without a word. She took a steadying breath and entered the lion's den. The room was as she remembered it, austere, meticulously organized, and cold. Lycomedes sat behind his large table of polished cypress wood. On its surface, the single star metal fragment, the one carved with a key, gleamed under the light. And standing before the table, stiff with self-importance, was Iason. The young acolyte's face lit with triumph as he saw her enter, certain he was about to witness her unmasking. "Elara," Lycomedes said, his voice a flat, neutral tone that was more unnerving than any anger. "Iason brings me a fascinating report. He tells me you were engaged in some unsanctioned excavation at the Siphnian treasury." Elara met the High Priest's gaze, her own expression a carefully constructed mask of calm professionalism. She then glanced at Iason, a flicker of feigned disappointment in her eyes. "I had intended to bring my full report to you myself, High Priest, along with Iason. His vigilance is commendable, a true testament to your teachings. He has a keen eye." She paused, letting the subtle praise land before delivering the barb. "His discretion, however, may need further refinement." The test was not merely to observe, but to understand the nature of a confidential task. Iason's smug expression faltered, a flicker of confusion clouding his eyes. Lycomedes's gaze sharpened, a flicker of interest replacing his cold suspicion. "A test?" he prompted. "Of course, High Priest," Elara said, moving forward and placing the obsidian stone on the table beside his star metal fragment. The polished black egg seemed to absorb the lamplight, a stark contrast to the fragment's alien luster. "As my research into the prophecy of the unbinding deepened, I found repeated references in pre-Apollonian texts to a series of focusing agents, objects used to stabilize and interpret the chaotic energies of the pneuma. The texts suggested one was hidden in a place of worldly vanity, shielded by a maiden's gaze, its location revealed only when the sun's light was humbled. It was a riddle, and I believed, a vital tool for the rite you are preparing." She had woven the truth of the catechism into the fabric of her lie, a technique she knew from studying ancient texts where fact and myth were inextricably tangled. Lycomedes leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the obsidian stone. He did not touch it. "And you did not see fit to inform me you were pursuing this riddle?" "I could not be certain of success," Elara replied smoothly. "To bring you a theory was a waste of your valuable time. To bring you a result is a service. I also, as I mentioned, took the opportunity to gauge the attentiveness of the junior acolytes, to see who was merely guarding the stones of the sanctuary and who was guarding its deeper secrets." She looked at Elara again, this time with a magnanimous smile. "Iason has proven he is among the latter." The young man puffed up with pride, his momentary confusion forgotten, replaced by the warm glow of her validation. He was no longer a witness, he was a participant in a secret, important game. Lycomedes was silent for a long, heavy moment. He picked up the obsidian stone, his long fingers wrapping around its smooth surface. Elara's heart pounded, but her face remained serene. He could feel its age, its history. Hecuba had been right. It felt important. "And what precisely is its function?" Lycomedes asked, his voice still laced with skepticism. "The texts call it the ophthalmos moirai, The Eye of the Fates, Elara said, the name coming to her in a flash of inspiration. It does not create visions, but clarifies them. When brought near a source of primary energy, like the star metal, it is said to quiet the discordant noise and reveal the core harmonic. It may allow you to read the true purpose of the prophecy, to understand the sleeper's voice without the millennia of distortion. It was the perfect bait. The promise of clarity, of pure and unadulterated knowledge, was the one thing she knew the scholar in him could not resist. His quest was not just about power, but about a certainty he believed had been denied to him. He placed the obsidian stone back on the table, a new light in his eyes. He had made his decision. Her lie, preposterous as it was, served his narrative better than the truth of her betrayal. To believe her meant he was still in control, that his most promising student was not a traitor, but was in fact demonstrating initiative that served his own ends. "Your initiative is bold," he said, the words a carefully measured blend of warning and approval, "but not unwelcome." He turned his gaze to Iason. "You have done well, Iason. You have proven yourself watchful. You are dismissed. Speak of this to no one." The acolyte bowed low, his face alight with pride, and practically floated out of the room. The door clicked shut behind him, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The game was over. The verdict was in. "Do not mistake my acceptance for credulity," Elara said. "You have placed yourself on a very narrow ledge, but the tool you have brought me is intriguing, and it presents an opportunity for a demonstration of its effectiveness and of your continued loyalty." He stood and walked to a large astronomical chart inscribed on a sheet of papyrus on the wall. "The alignment quickens. The resonances within the sanctuary are growing stronger. I have felt it myself. My own research points to another nexus of power, a place where the first voice of this mountain spoke, before Apollo silenced it." Ilara's blood ran cold. He knew.
"The Sibyl Rock," he said, turning back to face her. "The stone upon which the first Pythia was said to have sat, where she was slain by Apollo's arrow. The residual energy there will be immense, but unfocused, primal." He gestured to the obsidian stone. "Take your Eye of the Fates there at dawn tomorrow. Hold it to the rock. If it truly is a focusing agent, it should react. It should glow or hum or offer some kind of sign. I will be watching." He smiled, a thin, cruel curve of his lips. "Prove your story is true, Elara. Prove your new toy works. Or I will begin to believe Iason's first, simpler interpretation of the events he witnessed." Elara left the High Priest's chambers, her legs steady, but her insides a roiling sea of ice and fire. She had won. She had walked into the jaws of the beast, offered it a story, and the beast had swallowed it whole. But the victory was a poisoned chalice. She had until dawn to turn a lie into a truth, to make a simple stone perform a miracle for an audience of one. She returned to Hecuba's cell, the weight of her impossible task pressing down on her. The old woman saw the verdict in her face before she spoke a word. "He believes you," Hecuba said, her voice devoid of triumph. "For now," Elara confirmed, sinking onto the small stool. "But he has set a trial. I am to take the Moirai stone to the Sibyl Rock at dawn. He demands a sign, a reaction. He will be watching." She looked at the obsidian egg resting in her lap. It was beautiful, ancient, and utterly inert. "It's just a rock, isn't it?" "It is a rock that has focused the minds of seers for 1,000 years, Hecuba corrected gently. "Its power is in what it draws from the user, not what it projects on its own. It will not glow for Lycomedes." "Then I am lost," Elara whispered, the brittle shell of her composure finally cracking. No, Hecuba said, her voice firm. You are a librarian, a scholar. The power of the gods is a fearsome, unpredictable thing, but the power of man is in knowledge. If you cannot command the gods, then you must resort to the tricks of the alchemists. The word jolted Elara from her despair. Alchemists, scribes, the workshop. Phosphorus, she breathed, her mind racing. Certain minerals, ground fine and mixed with oil, can absorb the light of a lamp and release it slowly in the dark. A false light to fool a false priest, Hecuba nodded. But the effect is faint. Will it be enough? It has to be, Elara said, a desperate plan forming. He will be watching from a distance, in the half-light of dawn. A subtle glow may be more convincing than a great flash of light. She spent the next hour in the scribe's workshop, a place she knew better than her own small cell. Under the guise of mixing pigments for a new manuscript, she searched the dusty shelves of raw materials. She found what she was looking for in a small, lead-lined box, a lump of pale, waxy stone labeled phosphoros lapis from the mines in the east. It was rare, used to create faint, glowing inks for marking sacred passages meant to be read in darkened ritual chambers. Working feverishly, she scraped a small amount into a mortar and ground it to a fine powder, the pestle making a soft, rhythmic crunching that echoed the frantic beating of her heart. She mixed it with a drop of clear, viscous linseed oil, creating a nearly invisible paste. It was a pathetic, desperate deception, a child's trick against a master of intrigue. She knew, with a sinking certainty, it would not be enough. Lycomedes was too observant. He would expect more than a faint glimmer. She needed another layer to her lie, another ally in the dark. She needed Damon. Getting a message to him was a risk unto itself, but he had said his network was extensive. She had to trust he had a way to watch her, even in the sanctuary's most private corners. She went to the library, to the alcove dedicated to military history. She took down a scroll detailing the siege of Plataea and left it on a reading lectern, opened to a passage describing the use of signal fires. It was a crude, hopeful gesture, a message in a bottle thrown into a sea of shadows. She waited for what felt like an eternity in the moon-drenched silence of the colonnades, the small pot of phosphorescent paste concealed in her robes. She was about to give up, to resign herself to her flimsy trick, when a shadow detached itself from a deeper shadow behind a pillar. A bold request, little librarian. Are you so quick to seek my help? Lycomedes has set a trap for me at dawn, she said, turning to face him. She explained the test at the Sybil Rock, the need for a sign. I have a paste that will create a faint glow. It's not enough. He will see through it. Damon stepped closer, his form solid and menacing in the moonlight. He considered her for a moment, his expression unreadable. You want me to create a distraction, a flash of light, a sound? No, she said, surprising herself with her own clarity. That would be too obvious. He's not a fool. It has to come from the stone. It needs to be more than just light. It needs to resonate. He grunted, intrigued. And how do you propose to make a rock resonate? I don't know, she admitted. You're the soldier. You understand things I don't. Acoustics, sympathetic vibrations, things that are not magic, but seem like it to the uninitiated. A slow, wolfish grin touched Damon's lips. It was not a friendly expression, but one of professional appreciation. She wasn't just asking for help. She was thinking like an operative. He reached into a small pouch at his belt and produced an object. It was a small, flat disc of bronze, no bigger than her thumbnail, with a tiny, sharp barb at its center.
A Spartan field cricket, he said. We use them for signaling at night. When you press the center, it produces a high-frequency hum, almost too high to hear. But if you press the bronze against stone, he demonstrated on the marble column beside them. He pressed the disc to the stone, and a low, deep thrumming sound emanated from the pillar itself, a resonant hum that seemed to vibrate in her bones. It was uncanny, as if the stone itself were singing. The sound travels through the rock, he explained. It sounds like it's coming from everywhere at once. He handed it to her. The tiny device was cool and heavy in her palm. This, combined with your glowing paste, he mused, it might just be enough to sell the story. It will cost you. What do you want? She asked, her voice steady. The location of the next stone. The instant you know it. Agreed, she said without hesitation. It was a price she was more than willing to pay. Be careful, Elara, he added, his voice dropping to a near whisper. The more you rely on these tricks, the deeper you sink. One day, you will perform a trick, and your audience will demand an encore you cannot produce. He melted back into the shadows, leaving her with the cold bronze cricket and the even colder weight of his words. The pre-dawn air was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and cold stone. Elara climbed the winding path to the Sibyl Rock, a jagged outcrop of dark gray limestone that stood alone, overlooking the entire sanctuary. It was a place of immense power, raw and untamed. Here, Gaia's voice had once spoken, a torrent of primordial truth, before Apollo's arrow had pinned the first Pythia to the stone and silenced it forever. She saw him as she approached, a tall, robed figure standing on a higher ledge, silhouetted against the indigo sky. Lycomedes. He was perfectly still, a silent observer waiting for the performance to begin. Elara's hands trembled as she knelt before the Sibyl Rock. The stone was deeply fissured, its surface worn smooth by millennia of wind and rain. She placed the obsidian egg on a small flat ledge. Then, shielding her movements with her body, she dipped a finger into the oily paste and subtly coated the surface of the moirai stone. The phosphor was already absorbing the faint light of the rising sun. She began to chant, her voice low and clear. The words were nonsense, fragments of half-remembered hymns and invented incantations, but she delivered them with the solemn authority of a true priestess. She was playing a part, not just for Lycomedes, but for herself, building a wall of ritual to hold back her terror. As the eastern horizon began to burn with streaks of orange and rose, she pressed the bronze cricket against the base of the Sibyl Rock, hiding it with the folds of her robe. The effect was instantaneous and breathtaking. A low, resonant hum rose from the rock, a deep, soul-shaking thrum that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the mountain. At the same moment, the moirai stone began to emit a soft, ethereal glow. The phosphorescent paste, now fully charged by the dawn's first rays, gave off a gentle, pulsing light, the color of a captured moonbeam. The swirling nebulae within the obsidian seemed to churn and glow with a life of their own. Light and sound. It was more than a trick. In the sacred silence of the dawn, on this ancient and powerful rock, it felt real. It felt like magic. Elara held the pose, her hands outstretched over the glowing, humming stone, until the light began to fade and the hum died away as she released the pressure on the cricket. She remained kneeling, her head bowed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had done it. After a long minute, she heard the soft crunch of a sandal on the gravel path behind her. Lycomedes had descended from his perch. She did not dare to turn. The ophthalmos moirai, he said, his voice laced with a new and unfamiliar tone. It was not triumph, not satisfaction. It was awe. It truly is a key. He had bought it completely. The lie was now truth. It is, High Priest, she said, her voice a respectful murmur. He stepped past her and placed his hand on the Sibyl rock, as if expecting to feel the last echoes of its song. His gaze swept over the fractured surface of the ancient stone. The first voice was silenced here, he mused, his mind already moving on, connecting this new data to his grand theory. But energy is never destroyed. It merely changes form. It echoes. Elara watched him, her mind suddenly sharp and clear, the fear replaced by a hunter's focus. An echo. She looked at the rock, truly looked at it, not as a stage prop, but as a piece of the Catechism's puzzle. Where the first voice was silenced, its echo sleeps in shattered stone. It wasn't a metaphor.
The word hung in the air between them, an accidental key turned in a lock she hadn't known was there. Echoes. Elara kept her head bowed, her mind a whirlwind. Where the first voice was silenced, its echo sleeps in shattered stone. It wasn't a metaphor for the rock's history. It was a physical address. The stone was here, within reach. Lycomedes was lost in his own world, his gaze distant, already fitting this new piece into his grand, terrifying puzzle. The residual energy must have imprinted itself upon the rock's crystalline structure, he murmured, more to himself than to her. This ophthalmos moirai, it doesn't just focus the pneuma, it excites the lingering patterns within the stone, a resonance chamber. This was her chance. While his intellect was soaring through theoretical realms, she could act on the physical one. The patterns seem strongest along the main fissure, High Priest, she said, her voice a model of scholarly deference. She rose slowly and approached the Sibyl rock, keeping the obsidian stone in her hand as a prop. The one Mythology claims was left by Apollo's bow. May I examine it? Proceed, he said, his tone dismissive, his attention still elsewhere. Elara ran her fingers along the deep, jagged crack that split the rock's face. The stone was cold, ancient. She let her hand drift downwards, tracing the network of smaller, radiating fractures. The Catechism had said shattered stone, not the whole rock, but a piece of it. She felt for anything loose, any fragment that didn't belong. Her fingers brushed against a shard, no bigger than her palm, wedged deep in a side fissure. It looked like any other piece of weathered limestone, gray and pitted, but as her skin touched it, a faint, phantom vibration passed into her, a feeling like a distant bell that had just ceased to ring. The echo. Her heart leaped. Lycomedes had turned, his eyes now on her, a sharp, analytical glint in them. She couldn't just pry the stone out. It's fascinating, High Priest, she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. She tapped a spot on the rock a few feet away from the fragment. The geological composition here is different, almost fused, as if from a great heat. Lycomedes, ever the scholar, took the bait. He stepped closer, peering at the spot she indicated. Vitrification, he breathed, from the energy discharge, of course. The power required to slay a primordial seer would have been immense. It would have literally melted the stone. While his attention was fixed on the vitrified patch, her other hand worked at the loose shard. It was wedged tight. She dug her fingernails into the crack, praying it would give. For a terrible second, it held fast. Then, with a faint scraping sound that was lost in the morning breeze, it came free. It was surprisingly heavy, dense. She palmed it, its strange, silent resonance a secret fire against her skin, and drew her hand back into the folds of her sleeve. The implications are staggering, Lycomedes was saying, tracing the fused rock with his own finger. The entire sanctuary must be a matrix of such energy lines. It would seem so, High Priest, she agreed, rising to her feet. My work is done here. Yes, he said, his eyes gleaming with a feverish light. Go, I have calculations to make, texts to re-examine in this new light. She bowed and walked away, not daring to look back. The weight in her sleeve felt heavier than any stone. It felt like the weight of a stolen ghost. Back in the relative safety of Hecuba's cell, she unwrapped the sixth stone. It was a rough, unassuming piece of gray limestone on one side, but the other, the fractured surface, was anything but. It was a sheet of interlocking crystals that glittered like a frozen storm. And etched into this crystalline face, or perhaps a natural formation that looked chillingly like an etching, was the symbol of a circle shattered by a single, jagged line, like a bolt of lightning. The Echo Stone, Hecuba whispered, her hand hovering over it but not daring to touch. Elara placed it with the others, 6 of the 7. The collection was nearly complete. As the limestone fragment settled next to the star metal, its resonance joined the silent chorus. It was a profound emptiness, a lingering vibration that spoke of a sound that had been violently torn from the world. It was the sound of a scream that had been held for millennia.
"We are so close," Elara said, the reality of it settling on her. "And the path to the last is the most perilous of all," Hecuba said, her voice grim. She recited the final line of the catechism, the one she had held back. Her words fell like coffin nails into the silence. The final piece rests within the heart of the serpent's coiled power. Elara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "The serpent," she said, "Python, the great dragon Apollo slew on this very ground, and from whose rotting corpse the vapors of prophecy were said to first arise," Hecuba finished. "The pneuma, the place where that power is most concentrated, most controlled, the very heart of Apollo's authority and Python's prison, is the Adaton. The Adaton, the Holy of Holies, the sunken chamber beneath the temple floor where the Pythia sat on her tripod, where no man but the High Priest was ever permitted to enter. It was the most sacred, most heavily guarded, and most secret place in the known world." "It's impossible," Elara breathed. "All the steps have been impossible," Hecuba countered, though her voice lacked its usual fire. This is a fortress within a fortress." Elara knew she could not do this alone. Hecuba's knowledge was vital, but this task required a different kind of power. It required the wolf she had let into the sheepfold. Damon found her that night. She was not in the library or the colonnades. On instinct, she had gone to the gymnasium, a sprawling complex of running tracks and wrestling pits at the sanctuary's lower edge. It was a place of ordered, physical reality that felt like an antidote to the esoteric madness of her quest. He emerged not from the shadows, but from the open, walking across the moonlit training ground with the easy confidence of a man in his natural element. "The performance was a success, I hear," he began, his voice low. "The old priest is singing your praises to his inner circle. The prodigy of Delphi, they're calling you." "I've come to pay my debt," Elara said, cutting through the pleasantries. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her flustered. "I know where the last stone is." His eyes narrowed, all trace of mockery gone. "Where?" She took a breath. "In the Adaton." Damon's reaction was not one of shock, but of grim, professional assessment. He was a soldier looking at a map of an impregnable fortress. Beneath the temple of Apollo, the chamber of the Oracle. He let out a soft, mirthless laugh. "You don't choose easy hiding places, you and your priestess." "We didn't hide them," she reminded him. "No, you're just the ones cleaning up the mess." He paced a short distance away, his hands clasped behind his back. The chamber is below ground, one entrance through the temple proper. The doors to the temple are bronze, guarded day and night. The passage to the chamber itself is known only to the High Priest and the Pythia's attendants. It's a tactical impossibility. The Linnea, Elara said, the word falling into the space between them. The festival, Hecuba arranged it. The whole sanctuary will be focused on the theater. The priests will be occupied with the rites, the guards with the crowds. A distraction, he nodded, a flicker of appreciation in his eyes. Good, but a festival doesn't open a locked bronze door and show you a secret passage. Hecuba runs the temple's architecture, the old plans. There may be another way. A forgotten passage, a ventilation shaft, something the current priests have forgotten. And Lycomedes, the high priest, will not be enjoying the festival. He will be in his temple. This was the crux of it, the final, insurmountable obstacle. I don't know, she admitted, the words tasting like failure. He will be the final guardian. Damon stopped pacing and turned to face her fully. The moonlight cast his face in sharp planes and deep shadows. Sparta has an interest in seeing this through, a deeper interest than just an unstable neighbor. He seemed to be weighing his words, deciding on a new level of disclosure. Years ago, during the war with the Argives, one of our patrols in the Taygetus Mountains stumbled upon a cave. Inside, they found something, a shrine, but older than any god we knew. And there was a stone, much like the ones you carry. Our seers tried to understand it. They said it spoke of an ancient silence, a sleeping anger that made the squabbles of men seem like the buzzing of flies.
It drove 3 of them mad. Elara stared at him, stunned. Another stone, one she hadn't known about. What happened to it? Our kings, being the pious and practical men they are, had it sealed in a bronze casket, buried under 1,000 tons of rock, and declared the entire mountain forbidden. They know there are powers in this world that are not meant to be wielded. Lycomedes is a fool who has found the key to a cage, and he thinks the beast inside will be his pet. We know it will devour him and everyone else, starting with us. That is why I am here. This is not just a mission for me, Elara. It is an exorcism. The confession changed everything. He was not just an opportunist. He was a man with his own history with this terror, his own reasons to fear the sleeper. Their goals were, for now, truly aligned. "So you'll help?" she asked. "Help?" he scoffed. "I will lead. This is no longer a task for a librarian and a retired priestess. This is an infiltration." A general does not hand over his command to an ally just because the ally's voice is louder. Elara had waged this war in whispers and shadows, armed with fragments of poetry and a librarian's guile. She would not now become a foot soldier. "You will not lead," she said, the words quiet but unyielding. "You will advise. This is my sanctuary. These are my gods and my blasphemers. You know how to break down a door. I know which doors are worth opening. There is a difference." Damon's head tilted, a predator's gesture of curiosity. He had expected fear, or at least acquiescence. Instead, he got terms. A flicker of respect, hard-earned and dangerous, passed through his eyes. "The librarian has teeth," he observed. "Very well, we will collaborate. But understand this, when steel is needed, my hand will be the one to draw it. Agreed?" "When steel is needed," she countered, "it will mean our minds have failed." Agreed. They stood in the silent gymnasium, a treaty drawn between them in the moonlight. Their alliance was no longer one of convenience, but of shared, terrifying knowledge. Their council of war was held in Hecuba's cell, a cramped, tense gathering of 3 disparate worlds. Hecuba, the keeper of sacred history, Damon, the master of profane violence, and Elara, the bridge between them. She laid out the problem, the fortress of the Adyton, the festival as their cover, and the dragon at the gate, Lycomedes himself. "The old plans," Elara pressed, looking at Hecuba. "You mentioned another way."
The old priestess nodded slowly, her eyes on Damon, appraising him. The architects of Apollo built upon older foundations, she said, her voice a dry rustle. They built over the scars left by the god's victory. Before the temple, this was the grotto of the Earth Mother, and its rites were of water and darkness. There is a channel, cut from the living rock, that carried water from the Castalian spring to a purification basin that once sat where the Adyton is now. The priests of Apollo sealed it, calling it the Serpent's Gut, a profane passage. They walled up the entrance at the spring and built the temple's foundations over the basin, but the channel itself, it remains. Damon was instantly alert, his soldier's mind seizing on the tactical data. Where is the entrance? How was it sealed? Not at the main spring, where the pilgrims drink, Hecuba said. Higher up the mountain, at a forgotten source, hidden in a cleft between the two shining rocks. It was sealed with mortared stone, a barrier meant to last for eternity. Eternity is a long time, Damon said, a grim smile touching his lips. Mortar and stone can be broken. And Lycomedes, Elara asked, bringing them back to the final, most difficult obstacle. He will not leave the temple during the Linnea. He will be preparing. He will be waiting for the energies to peak. He is a single point of failure, Damon stated, his voice flat. Points of failure should be removed, permanently. The casual brutality of his suggestion hung in the air. No, Elara said immediately. We are not assassins. We do not shed blood on the most sacred ground in Hellas. It would be a sacrilege from which Delphi would never recover. We cannot become the evil we are trying to stop. Piety is a luxury we may not be able to afford, Damon countered. Then we will find another way, Hecuba insisted, her gaze firm. We will not desecrate the omphalos with murder. For a long moment, the Spartan and the priestess were locked in a battle of wills. Damon, the pragmatist, saw only an obstacle to be eliminated. Hecuba, the guardian of tradition, saw a line that could not be crossed. It was Elara, the scholar, who saw the third path. Her mind flew to Lycomedes' fatal flaw, not his ambition, not his cruelty, but his arrogance, his unshakable belief in his own intellect. We don't remove him, she said, the idea taking shape as she spoke. We occupy him. We build a cage for his mind. She looked at Damon. You said he is praising me, calling me a prodigy? His acolytes whisper it in the halls, Damon confirmed. Good. He trusts my scholarship. He believes I am his most brilliant instrument. She began to pace the tiny cell, her energy filling the space. I will forge a text, a lost fragment from a pre-Pythian scribe. I will fill it with impossibly complex astrological charts, numerological equations, and cryptic verses that seem to relate to the rite of unbinding. I'll weave in details from the research he and I have done together, things only we would know, to give it authenticity. I will make it the most compelling, infuriating puzzle he has ever seen. Damon's eyes narrowed in understanding. A intellectual honeypot. Exactly, Elara said, her eyes bright. I will have Yasin, his loyal, watchful dog, discover it and deliver it to him on the afternoon of the Linnea. He will not be able to resist. He will lock himself away with it, convinced it is the final key to understanding the sleeper. He will not be guarding the temple. He will be hunched over a table, lost in a labyrinth of my own making. It will buy us the time we need. Hecuba stared at her, a slow, grudging admiration dawning on her face. To use knowledge not as a light, but as a net, she murmured. It is a dangerous game. It is his game, Elara replied. I'm just learning how to play. The days leading up to the Linnea became a blur of clandestine activity. By day, Elara was the diligent librarian, the celebrated prodigy, answering Lycomedes' probing questions with carefully constructed theories that reinforced her fabricated loyalty. But by night, she was a forger. In the scriptorium, she painstakingly aged a sheet of high-quality papyrus with weak tea and pomegranate dust.
She mixed inks using ancient formula, and with a borrowed stylus, she began to craft her masterpiece of deception, a web of lies so intricate it felt like truth. Meanwhile, Damon became a ghost. He moved through the sanctuary's periphery, and one night he returned to their meeting place with dust on his tunic and a satisfied look in his eyes. He had found the sealed entrance, a slab of rock and mortar hidden behind a curtain of ancient ivy, just as Hecuba had described. He had tested its strength, calculated the tools he would need, the time it would take to break through without making a sound. The festival began with a procession, a riot of color and sound that spilled down the slopes of Parnassus. Flute music and drunken hymns echoed off the treasury walls. The air grew thick with the smells of roasting meat, spilled wine, and sacrificial smoke. The sanctuary transformed from a place of solemn piety into a raucous, sprawling celebration. The crowds provided the perfect cover, their joyous chaos a shield for the conspiracy taking place in their midst. On the third day of the festival, Elara gave the forged scroll to Iason. She presented it as a momentous discovery, a burden she was not wise enough to carry herself, entrusting it to him to deliver to their master. The acolyte's eyes went wide with self-importance. He all but snatched it from her, running to the temple to deliver the great news. Elara watched him go, a cold knot of anxiety in her stomach. The trap was set. That evening, as the main theatrical performance began, filling the great stone amphitheater with thousands of spectators, Damon met Elara near the gymnasium. He was no longer the Spartan diplomat. He was dressed in dark, practical leather, his movements economical and silent. He carried a heavy leather satchel. He handed her a bundle. Inside was a dark gray tunic and leggings of soft, durable wool. "There will be water," he said, his voice all business, "and tight spaces. This is better than a peplos." She changed quickly, the unfamiliar clothes feeling like a uniform for a role she had never intended to play. When she emerged, Damon gave her a single, critical look. "Good. You look like a shadow." They moved up the mountain, staying clear of the main paths, their route a twisting, secret geography known only to goatherds and spies. The sound of the chorus from the theater below, a great wave of human voices singing a tragedy, rose and fell on the wind. It was the perfect soundtrack for their endeavor. They reached the cleft between the shining rocks. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and thyme. Damon pulled back a thick mat of ivy, revealing a section of wall that was subtly wrong. The stones were too uniform, the mortar too precise for a natural rock face. This was the seal. Damon pulled a long, thin steel pry bar and a heavy mallet from his satchel. He wrapped the head of the mallet in thick cloth to muffle the sound. "From here on, silence," he whispered. He looked at her, his face serious in the deepening twilight. "Are you ready?" Elara looked down the mountainside, at the distant, flickering torchlight of the festival, at the world of men and gods going about its business, oblivious. Then she looked at the stone wall that hid the serpent's gut. She was terrified, but for the first time, she was not alone. "Yes," she said, her voice a steady whisper. He nodded once, then set to work. The sharp, metallic chink of the mallet striking the pry bar was a desecration in the sacred quiet. Damon worked with a focused, brutal efficiency, his movements precise and devoid of wasted energy. He found the seams in the ancient mortar, leveraging his strength not against the stone itself, but against the bonds that held it. With a final, groaning scrape, a large section of the seal gave way, revealing a maw of absolute darkness that exhaled a breath of cold, stagnant air. "The serpent's gut," Damon whispered, peering into the gloom. Hecuba was not speaking in poetry. He lit a small, shielded oil lamp, its light pushing back a darkness that felt solid and ancient. The channel was narrow, its sides slick with moisture and a pale, ghostly moss. A trickle of water, the forgotten source of the Castalian spring, ran down the center, cold enough to ache in their bones. Elara, her scholar's robes replaced by the practical wool of a shadow, followed him in, the stone blocks scraping shut behind them, plunging them into a world apart. The passage was a journey into the mountain's deep past. The air was heavy with the smell of wet stone and decay. Their footsteps echoed unnaturally, and the sound of the distant festival faded to a phantom pulse they could feel more than hear. Elara trailed a hand along the wall. It was not worked stone, but living rock, carved by water and then widened by hands that had prayed to a different, older pantheon. She felt a profound sense of trespass, of walking through a wound in the world. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel began to widen and ascend. The air grew warmer, and a new scent reached them, a strange, sweet, and metallic odor that made the head swim. Damon extinguished the lamp. Ahead, a faint, pearlescent light filtered through a series of cracks in a stone ceiling. "We're here," he breathed. He found the exit, a heavy, circular stone plug in the floor of a small antechamber. Working together, they managed to shift it, the grating sound monstrous in the sudden silence. They emerged into the sacred heart of the world. The Auditon was not a grand chamber, but an intimate, subterranean space. The air hummed with a palpable energy, the famous pneuma, which rose in a shimmering, almost invisible haze from a fissure in the floor. In the center of the room, directly over the fissure, stood the three-legged bronze tripod, the seat of the Pythia. Against one wall rested the omphalos, the navel stone of the world, its surface covered in intricate carvings. The only light came from this stone, which emitted a soft internal luminescence, casting the room in an otherworldly glow. This was the nexus, the heart of Apollo's power and Python's grave. "The heart of the serpent's coiled power," Elara whispered, her eyes scanning the room. The omphalos was carved with a pattern of woven nets, a symbol of Apollo's order. The tripod was his instrument. Neither felt right. Her gaze was drawn back to the source of it all, the fissure in the floor. It was a jagged, dark wound in the rock from which the prophetic vapor rose. It was Python's last breath. The serpent wasn't a coil of rope. It was the coiled, trapped energy beneath their feet. The heart of that power was its point of release. She knelt, ignoring Damon's cautionary hiss. She peered into the crack. Deep within, nestled between two ledges of rock just beyond arm's reach, was a stone. It was not gray or black, but a deep serpentine green, veined with threads of gold that caught the omphalos's light. Carved into its surface was an Ouroboros, a serpent devouring its own tail, the symbol of eternal cycles, of a power that fed upon itself, the final lock. "I need something to pry it out," she said. Damon passed her the thin steel bar. As she reached into the fissure, a voice, cold and sharp with intellectual fury, cut through the sacred silence. "A most ingenious, if flawed, piece of forgery, Elara." They froze. Lycomedes stood in the doorway from the temple proper, his face a mask of cold rage. In his hand he held her forged scroll. "The retrograde motion of Jupiter in the 5th house," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You based your chart on the Calippic cycle, but the pre-Apollinaean mystics used a sidereal model. A subtle error, but enough to unravel the entire fabrication." His eyes fell on the 6 stones Elara had laid out on a nearby ledge, then to the prybar in her hand.
The last vestiges of his faith in her evaporated, replaced by the chilling certainty of betrayal. "All this time," he hissed, "you were not my instrument. You were a saboteur." He took a step into the chamber. "Give them to me. You have dabbled in forces you cannot possibly comprehend." I comprehend them better than you, Elara retorted, finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. She worked the pry bar, and the seventh stone came loose with a soft clatter. She snatched it up. You think the prophecy is about unleashing a power? You're wrong. It's about containing one. As the seventh stone, the serpent stone, touched her hand, the resonance of the other six changed. The profound silence they projected coalesced. It was not a void, but a presence of absolute negation. In that instant, holding the complete set, she understood. The prophecy was a warning, misinterpreted by generations of ambitious men. The stones were not a key, they were the locks for the sleeper's cage. The unbinding was not to unleash the sleeper, but to unbind the world from its silent, terrifying influence. To destroy the gods was to remove the primordial fear upon which their power was built, to force mortals to stand on their own. The sleeper is not a weapon, Lycomedes, she said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. It is an abyss, a mindless, cosmic hunger that predates the gods. It doesn't want to rule the world, it wants to unmake it. Lies, Lycomedes snarled, his fanaticism hardening his features. The desperate words of a heretic. You would keep humanity chained to these petty, capricious Olympians. I will set it free. He lunged, not at Elara, but at the stones she had laid out. Damon moved like lightning, intercepting him. The Spartan was stronger, but the High Priest was fueled by a mad certainty. They grappled, their struggle a brutal intrusion in the hollowed space, their grunts and the scrape of their sandals echoing off the ancient walls. Elara knew steel would solve nothing. This was a battle of belief. She clutched the seven stones, their collected silence a shield of cold clarity in her mind. You want to see it, Lycomedes? She cried out. You want to understand the power you serve? Then look. She didn't throw a weapon. She didn't chant an incantation. She focused her will, her intent through the seven stones, aiming them not at his body, but at his mind. She did not project power. She opened a pinhole, a momentary channel through the null field the stones created, exposing him to the barest whisper of the sleeper's true nature. For a fraction of a second, Lycomedes' mind touched the abyss. He saw no grand sentient god. He saw a formless, thoughtless, endless entropy, a cosmic grinding down of all things, light, life, thought, hope, into a uniform, silent gray. It was the absolute, eternal, and utterly pointless end of everything. He screamed. It was not a sound of pain, but of a soul being hollowed out. He staggered back from Damon, his hands flying to his head. The arrogant fire in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by the vast, vacant horror of a man who has stared into the sun and seen only a black hole. He collapsed beside the omphalos, his body curling into a ball, his lips moving in a silent, broken babble. His intellect, the thing he valued above all else, had been shattered by the truth he had so desperately sought. Silence descended, broken only by the High Priest's whimpering. Damon stood panting, looking from the broken man to Elara, a new, profound respect in his eyes. She had won, not with a blade, but with a revelation. She looked at the seven stones in her hands. They were the most dangerous objects in existence, not because of the power they held, but because of the power they contained. It's over, Damon said, his voice low. No, Elara replied, looking at his stones. It's just beginning. They left Lycomedes to be found by his acolytes, a high priest driven mad by a vision from his god. They sealed the passage behind them, leaving the serpent's gut to its cold, silent sleep. In Hecuba's cell, they laid the 7 fragments on the table. The old woman looked at them, then at Elara's face, and understood everything. They cannot remain together, Hecuba said, her voice filled with a final, weary wisdom. And they cannot remain in Delphi, Elara added. This place will always attract men like him. A new plan was forged, not of infiltration, but of conservation. Damon would take 1 stone, the star metal key, back to Sparta. He would have his kings bury it even deeper than its brother, guarding it with Spartan steel and discipline. Hecuba would use her network of loyal priestesses, women scattered across the Hellenic world, to secret away 4 others, hiding them in forgotten tombs, remote island caves, and the foundations of rival temples. And the last 2? Damon asked, looking at Elara. The Echo Stone will stay with Hecuba, Elara said. Its power is bound to this place, and she is its best guardian. She picked up the Serpent Stone, the Ouroboros, and this one I will take myself. I will find a place for it so far from the memory of men that no one will ever think to look for it. Her arc was complete. She was no longer just a librarian, a keeper of stories that had already been written. She was now a creator of secrets, a guardian of the silence. Damon left the next day, a small, heavy pouch concealed in his traveler's pack. He and Elara exchanged no sentimental farewells, only a nod of profound, shared understanding. He was a soldier, and she was a sentinel, and they were now bound by a secret greater than any king or god. Elara stayed in Delphi for another month, helping Hecuba restore order, watching as a new, less ambitious high priest was chosen. She moved through the hollowed halls, no longer an acolyte, but a quiet authority no one could name. The world was safe, but it was a safety it could never know it had. One evening, as the sun set behind the mountains, she stood with Hecuba on the terrace overlooking the sanctuary. The festival was a memory, and the pilgrims' serene faith had returned. "Are you ready?" Hecuba asked. Elara clutched the small, heavy weight hidden in her robes. "I am," she said. She was leaving Delphi, walking away from the only home she had ever known. She was heading north, towards the cold, wild lands of the Hyperboreans, with a story to bury and a silence to keep. She was the Oracle's secret, and her watch had just begun.